How long have you been obeying a voice you never chose and calling it yourself? Not once, not consciously, but in quiet repetitions that slipped past your attention. Phrases that felt harmless, reasonable, even protective, until they stopped sounding like options and started feeling like truth, guiding your decisions before you ever realized a decision had been made. Because the most influential force in your life does not announce itself. It blends in. It speaks in your tone. It uses your words. And that is why it is rarely questioned. The way you speak to yourself does not disappear after the moment passes. It accumulates, like small transactions you never track, slowly shaping what feels possible, what feels distant, what feels out of reach, until one day the pattern is no longer something you notice, but something you live inside of. An emotion, when it is held long enough, does not stay temporary. It settles, it forms. The way something poured beneath the surface hardens into structure. Your repeated inner states begin to define the reality you move through. Not immediately, but with a quiet precision that is easy to overlook until it is already in place. So the focus moves outward, trying to change circumstances, trying to adjust what can be seen. Without noticing that the instruction has been coming from within all along, repeated consistently enough to shape direction without force. But there is a point where this becomes clear, a subtle recognition that what you have been repeating has not been neutral, that it has been functioning less like commentary and more like command, organizing your life not through effort, but through what is sustained. And when that is seen, something shifts, not dramatically, but fundamentally. Because control was never where you were looking for it. It was always here, in what you continue, in what you reinforce, in what you allow to stay. Because what you repeat becomes structure, and from here, a different beginning becomes possible. Not loud, not immediate, but exact. A shift in the next instruction you give yourself. Because a life does not change in a single moment. It changes the moment something is no longer agreed with the same way. And that moment begins with you. Chapter 1. The frequency you are there is something you have been doing every second of your life. Something so constant, so familiar, that it has become invisible to you. And yet it is the one activity shaping your relationships, your opportunities, your struggles, and even the limits you believe are real. And once you see it clearly, you will find it almost impossible to continue explaining your life the way you used to. There is a question hidden inside that realization, a question human beings have avoided for centuries, not because it is complex, but because its answer removes the last place where blame can comfortably exist. It is not a complicated question. It is almost ruthless in its clarity. What are you broadcasting right now? Not what you think you feel, not what you hope will happen, not what you ask for in your quietest moments, but what is actually moving through you. What is being expressed without interruption? What is being emitted into the field around you at every moment of your life? Because there is a vast and often invisible distance between what a person believes they are feeling and what they are in fact radiating. A gap so wide that entire lives unfold inside it without ever being questioned. Where someone can claim calm while carrying tension, speak of trust while expecting failure, or insist on clarity while moving through confusion they never fully acknowledge. And reality does not organize itself around what is declared. It organizes itself around what is sustained. In the early foundations of modern physics, a discovery emerged that did not fit comfortably within the way reality had been understood for centuries. A physicist examining the nature of matter observed that what appears solid is not truly solid in the way it seems, that beneath every object, every surface, every form, there is continuous motion, vibration, a deeper layer of activity holding everything together. Not static, not fixed, but dynamic. He proposed that behind every particle, behind every structure composing the physical world, there exists an underlying force maintaining this vibration, an invisible intelligence organizing what appears as matter. This was not philosophy, it was observation. The universe, in this view, is not a collection of isolated objects suspended in empty space. It is a unified field of energy, a continuous system of frequencies, where everything that exists is a pattern of vibration within that field. And within this field, you are not separate. You are not merely observing. You are participating. Because you are not silent. You are transmitting. Not occasionally, Not only when you decide to, but constantly. While you sleep, while you move through your day, while you react, think, remember, anticipate, or worry, something is always being expressed through you. Your internal state does not remain inside you. It extends. It interacts. It becomes part of the field you exist within. You have felt this before in simple ways. You walk into a room and sense tension or ease without knowing why. You stand near someone and feel drawn or repelled before a single word is spoken. Nothing visible explains it. Yet, it is real, because what is carried internally becomes atmosphere. And over time, it begins to shape patterns, the way interactions unfold, the way people respond, the way opportunities appear or fail to appear. Not instantly, but consistently. Scientific observation has shown that the human heart produces an electromagnetic field that extends beyond the body, and that this field shifts depending on emotional state. When a person remains in prolonged fear, resentment, or tension, the pattern becomes irregular and incoherent. When that same person experiences genuine appreciation, calm focus, or steady confidence, the pattern becomes more ordered and coherent. This coherence is not just internal, it affects the body, it influences rhythm, and it changes how others respond in proximity. Because coherence is not only a feeling, it is a pattern, and patterns interact. So pause here, not to fix anything, not to force anything, but to see clearly. What has been the dominant state you have been living in over the past year? Not the version you present, not the one you claim, the one that remains when you are alone, when nothing is being managed, when silence leaves you with what is actually there. Because whatever that state is, it has been shaping your life with more precision than you realize. Not as punishment, not as reward, but as consequence. If that state has been filled with worry, tension, quiet resentment, comparison, or a subtle expectation that things will not work out, then you may already be holding the explanation for why your life continues to reflect similar patterns. Not because life is unfair, not because you were placed in the wrong conditions, but because what you have been sustaining has been influencing what organizes around you. This is the point where resistance appears, where the mind begins to reject the idea, where it feels too simple to accept. Because the alternative is more comfortable, the belief that life is shaped by external forces, that circumstances define experience, that control exists somewhere outside of you. But consider that belief carefully. What has it changed? What has it improved? Or has it simply explained why things remain the same? There is another way to see it, not as control, but as participation. That what you sustain internally contributes to what unfolds externally. Not through force, not through effort, but through repetition, through what is held long enough to take form. Even in physics, observation has been shown to influence outcome, suggesting that awareness is not separate from what occurs, but involved in its formation. And if that is true, then something becomes clear. You are not outside your life, you are involved in it, through your attention, through your state, through what you continue. Which brings everything back to a single point. Not what you want, not what you plan, but what you are being. Because being comes before having. State comes before result. The field precedes the form. There is a simple story that makes this impossible to ignore. A student once asked how to bring better conditions into life. The teacher did not give a method. Instead, he filled a bowl with murky water and asked if clean water could be added to make it pure. The answer was obvious, not until something is removed. And in the same way, before anything new can take shape, what has been consistently sustained must first be seen clearly, not judged, not resisted, but recognized. Because what you continue, continues. Fear, when sustained, tends to produce more reasons to fear. Gratitude, when sustained, tends to reveal more to appreciate. A sense of lack narrows perception. A sense of sufficiency expands it, not instantly, but consistently. This is not belief, it is pattern. And once a pattern is seen, it can change, not all at once, but at the point where it is no longer repeated in this. So the question returns, but now with greater weight. Before the day begins, before anything unfolds, before the outside world sets its tone, there is a quieter decision available. What are you going to broadcast? Not what you will do, not what you will ask for, but what you will be, because that is where everything begins. Chapter 2, the mirror. The part of your life you keep explaining away is the part that has been telling the truth about you all along. The life you are living right now, in its patterns, its repetitions, its quiet consistencies, and its familiar frustrations, is not as unclear as it sometimes feels, nor as random as it often appears, but is instead a remarkably precise reflection of something that has been taking place within you for far longer than you have been willing to observe it directly. And the moment you allow yourself to see that reflection without softening it, without explaining it away, it becomes increasingly difficult to continue believing that what you experience is separate from what you carry. What stands in front of you is not a mystery waiting to be solved. It is a mirror that has been reporting with unwavering accuracy the condition of your inner state, not occasionally, continuously. And you do not need anyone to interpret it for you, because the evidence is already present in the life you have, in the results that repeat, in the cycles that return even when you try to move away from them, in the subtle sense that certain outcomes seem to follow you regardless of where you go. This idea is not new. It has appeared in different forms across cultures that never shared language or history, yet arrived at the same conclusion: that what is held within does not remain hidden, but expresses itself outwardly with a consistency that eventually becomes undeniable. But where older traditions spoke in metaphor, modern understanding offers something more exact, revealing not only that this reflection exists, but how it operates beneath awareness. Your brain does not show you everything. It selects. At every moment, an immense amount of information surrounds you, far more than you could ever consciously process. And within your system, a filtering process determines what is allowed into awareness and what is ignored, not randomly, but according to what your mind has learned to consider relevant. And relevance is not neutral. It is shaped by what you repeatedly believe, expect, and feel, which means that what you call reality is, in part, a selection, a version of the world that aligns with the state you have been carrying, so that two people moving through the same environment can come away with entirely different experiences, not because the world changed, but because their internal condition filtered it differently. One notices opportunity, the other registers limitation. One sees connection, the other sees distance. And both are convinced they are seeing things as they are. From here, a pattern emerges, one that is easy to overlook precisely because it feels so natural, where what you carry influences what you notice, and what you notice reinforces what you carry, forming a loop that becomes increasingly stable over time, until it no longer feels like a loop at all, but like reality itself. Not because reality is fixed, but because the filter has remained consistent. This is why two individuals can emerge from the same conditions and create entirely different lives. Not because the external facts were different, but because the meaning assigned to those facts was different. And that meaning shaped a state, and that state shaped perception. And that perception selected the evidence that confirmed itself. One person looks back and sees fuel. Another looks back and sees limitation. One interprets difficulty as direction. Another interprets it as restriction. And from those interpretations, different internal patterns are formed, and from those patterns, different lives unfold. So when you look at your own life, what you are seeing is not simply circumstance, it is correspondence. Your financial situation, your relationships, your physical and mental condition, the patterns that repeat across time, the outcomes that seem to return even when the details change, all of it is information, all of it is data. All of it is a reflection of something that has been sustained beneath the surface. And the reason this is difficult to face is not because it is complicated, but because it removes the final distance between what you experience and what you are responsible for, not in a way that blames, but in a way that reveals connection. The mirror does not argue, it does not explain, it does not soften, it reflects, with a consistency that can feel uncomfortable precisely because it is so accurate. And accuracy, when it is no longer avoided, changes the position from which you experience your life. Because as long as the reflection is treated as something happening to you, it remains something you react to. But the moment it is seen as something responding to you, it becomes something you can begin to understand. This is where the familiar resistance appears. The instinct to reject the idea, to call it too simple, to return to the more comfortable belief that life is shaped primarily by external forces, that circumstances determine experience, that control exists somewhere outside of you. But consider that belief carefully. What has it changed? What has it improved? Or has it simply allowed you to describe your situation without ever altering the pattern that sustains it? If you look again, more directly this time, something begins to shift, not in what you see, but in how you interpret what you see. As patterns that once felt like obstacles begin to reveal themselves as signals, as repetition begins to look less like bad luck and more like structure, as outcomes begin to look less like coincidence and more like correspondence. There is a simple way to make this visible without turning it into theory. Take a few moments, without distraction, and look at 3 areas of your life as they are right now: your finances, your relationships, your physical and mental condition, and describe each one in a single clear sentence, not what you want them to be, not what you plan for them to become, but what is actually present. Those sentences will not be comfortable, but they will be accurate, and accuracy is enough. Because once you can see what is there without adding to it, without defending against it, something changes in your position as you move from reacting to observing and from observing to understanding. And understanding opens a different possibility, not control in the sense of forcing outcomes, but participation in the sense of recognizing how what you carry relates to what you encounter. Because once the connection is seen, even slightly, the mirror is no longer something you avoid. It becomes something you use, not as judgment, but as calibration, not as limitation, but as information. And in that shift, something quiet but fundamental takes place, as what once felt like something happening to you begins to reveal itself as something responding to you. Not instantly, not perfectly, but consistently enough to matter. So the mirror remains exactly where it has always been, unchanged, available, precise. And what changes is not the reflection, but your willingness to see it clearly. Because what is seen clearly is no longer repeated in the same way. Chapter 3. The Science of Embodied Desire. The reason what you want has not arrived is not because you asked incorrectly. It is because your body has been living as someone who does not have it. Wishing, in the way most people understand it, has almost no power. And this is something that is rarely said directly because it disrupts a very comfortable illusion. The idea that thinking about something long enough or repeating it often enough will eventually cause it to appear. When in reality, the deeper laws that govern experience operate with a precision that has nothing to do with what you say you want and everything to do with what you are. A desire that exists only in words, only in surface-level thought, only in the part of the mind that can articulate but not transform, does not register in the deeper field where outcomes are organized, in the same way that writing a letter and never sealing it does not ensure it will ever arrive, no matter how clearly the message is written. Because the field you are interacting with does not respond to language. It responds to state. And the distance between thinking you want something and being aligned with it internally is not small. It is vast. Wide enough that most people spend years attempting to bridge it with effort, without realizing that the gap is not in what they are doing, but in what they are being. Modern neuroscience has begun to describe this with increasing clarity, showing that the brain and body are not separate systems, but deeply interconnected processes that continuously reinforce each other, where repeated emotional states become biochemical patterns, and those patterns begin to define what the body expects as normal. Studies on neuroplasticity have shown that the brain reorganizes itself based on repeated experience. But what is often overlooked is that experience does not need to come from the outside to have this effect. Because when an emotional state is generated strongly enough within the body, the brain registers it as real, regardless of whether it originated from an external event or an internally sustained condition. There have been documented cases where individuals, through deep states of focus and emotional immersion, were able to shift their internal biology in ways that conventional models struggled to explain, not by imagining outcomes in a superficial way, but by entering a state where the body itself began to operate as if the desired condition already existed. In those moments, something important was happening. The body was no longer waiting for reality to change. It was aligning with a different version of reality before it appeared. And the body, being a system that continuously seeks coherence, began to reorganize itself accordingly. This is where the idea of desire changes completely. Desire is not something you think, it is something you become. And most people never cross that threshold. They visualize what they want while remaining emotionally anchored in the absence of it, which creates a contradiction, where the image suggests one thing but the state reinforces another, and it is the state that carries weight. You can imagine abundance while feeling scarcity. You can picture connection while carrying isolation. You can describe success while expecting failure. And in each case, the signal that is being sent is not the image, but the underlying condition. From a deeper perspective, this makes sense. In physics, there is a principle suggesting that observation is not passive, that the observer is not separate from what is observed, but participates in bringing a particular outcome into form from a range of possibilities. If this is true even at the smallest scales, then it implies something significant at the level of your own life. You are not watching a fixed reality unfold. You are involved in shaping it, not through force, but through alignment, through the state you consistently embody, which means that what you call desire is not about wanting more. It is about matching. Matching, at the level of being, the condition you are attempting to experience. And this is where most approaches fail, because they begin from lack. They imagine from absence. They attempt to create from a state that contradicts what they are asking for. And that contradiction is what is being reinforced. To understand this more clearly, consider a simple distinction. There is a difference between thinking about a life and living as the person who inhabits it, even before it is visible. One is conceptual, the other is embodied. One is effort, the other is identity. And it is identity that organizes behavior, perception, and ultimately outcome. This is why the process requires something different from what most people expect. It is not about repeating phrases. It is not about forcing belief. It is about entering a state where the separation between what you imagine and what you feel begins to dissolve, where the body no longer waits for confirmation from the outside, but begins to operate from a different internal baseline. In that state, you are not imagining the result. You are moving as if it is already part of you, not in a performative way, not in a forced way, but in a quiet, stable way that does not need to prove itself. There is an old illustration that makes this distinction clear. Two people are given the same task, to build something complex. One begins immediately, acting, assembling, trying to bring form into existence through effort alone, adjusting as they go, reacting to what appears, and while progress is made, the structure lacks coherence because it is being created without a unified internal model. The other waits, not passively, but deliberately. They construct the entire structure internally first, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived experience, where every detail is familiar, where every part has been felt, where the finished result already exists in a way that does not require imagination to sustain it. And when they begin to act, they are not creating something new. They are expressing something that is already complete within them. This is the difference, and it is not subtle. One approach produces inconsistency, the other produces alignment. One is driven by effort, the other by coherence. When you begin to understand this, the idea of desire changes. It is no longer about asking, it is about becoming, not in theory, but in practice, in the way your body holds itself, in the way your attention moves, in the way your internal state stabilizes. And from that point, something shifts, not immediately in what you see, but in how things begin to organize. Because once the internal condition changes, the external arrangement has something different to respond to. Not magically, but systematically. This is not daydreaming. It is not passive imagination. It is one of the most demanding forms of inner work because it requires consistency, honesty, and the willingness to release the familiar identity that has been reinforced for years. And it begins in a way that is almost deceptively simple. By noticing, with precision, the difference between what you say you want and what you are currently being. Because that difference is where everything is decided. Chapter 4. The words that sculpt worlds. The words you repeat every day feel harmless, but they are quietly locking you into the very life you say you're trying to escape. The way you speak, especially when no one is listening, is quietly building the structure of your life, and most of what you call circumstance has already been rehearsed in the language you use every day without realizing what you are reinforcing. Long before writing existed, before symbols were carved into stone or pressed into clay, before language became something you could see, it was something you could feel, something that moved through the body and into the world as vibration, as sound, as a force that did not merely describe reality, but participated in shaping it. Across cultures that never met, this understanding appeared again and again, expressed in different forms, but pointing to the same principle, that the word is not only a tool for communication, but an instrument of creation, something that carries intention, emotion, and structure into the field of experience. In one tradition, it was called logos. In another, vak. In another, dabar. Different names for the same idea, that the word does not simply report what is, it influences what becomes. When ancient texts spoke of creation beginning with the word, it was often interpreted symbolically as metaphor, as something poetic rather than literal. But when viewed through a modern lens, something more precise begins to emerge, something that no longer relies on belief, but can be understood through mechanism. Sound is vibration. Vibration is the foundation of form. And form, as physics has shown, is not static, but the result of energy patterns organizing themselves at specific frequencies, which means that every word you speak is not just a meaning, it is a pattern. A vibration carrying both structure and emotional charge into the environment around you. There have been experiments attempting to visualize this, showing that when water is exposed to different forms of language, to words infused with appreciation or hostility, the structures that form under certain conditions reflect that difference, becoming either ordered or fragmented depending on the quality of what was introduced. While the methodology of such experiments has been debated, the underlying principle has continued to appear in more rigorous fields, suggesting that sound, and more specifically human speech combined with emotion, has measurable effects on biological systems. And when you consider that the human body itself is composed largely of water, the implication becomes less abstract and more immediate. The way you speak is not only heard, it is absorbed. Every time you repeat a phrase about your life, especially one that carries emotional weight, you are not merely describing what is happening. You are reinforcing a pattern. When you say, "This always happens to me," or "I never seem to get ahead," or "Nothing ever works out," you are not observing reality. You are stabilizing it. Because repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity becomes expectation, and expectation shapes what your mind continues to notice and confirm. At the same time, simply reversing those statements in a superficial way does not solve the problem. If you have spent years reinforcing a particular belief, introducing a statement that directly contradicts it often creates resistance, because the mind does not accept information that feels too far removed from its current model. Instead of integrating the new statement, it pushes back, generating thoughts that restore the previous pattern, not out of stubbornness, but out of a need for internal coherence. This is why repeating something you do not believe rarely produces change. Not because language has no power, but because the state behind the language does not match the words being spoken. There is, however, a different approach, one that does not force belief, one that does not create conflict. Instead of making declarations that your system rejects, you begin to introduce direction through inquiry. A statement closes. A question opens. A statement demands agreement. A question invites exploration. When you ask, "Why is this always difficult?" your mind searches for confirmation of difficulty. When you ask, "How might this become easier?" the direction shifts, not dramatically, but subtly. And subtle shifts, repeated over time, become significant. Language, then, is not only something you use to communicate with others, it is something you use to guide your own perception. The way you speak about your past shapes how you carry it. The way you speak about your present shapes what you notice within it. And the way you speak about your future influences what you begin to consider possible, because words do not stay on the surface. They move inward. They organize thought, they influence state, and state influences everything else. This is why two people can live through similar experiences and carry them in completely different ways. One frames the past as limitation, the other as instruction. One describes the present as burden, the other as process. And over time, those descriptions become more than language. They become identity. If you listen carefully, you can begin to hear the patterns, not only in what you say to others, but in what you repeat to yourself. The phrases that return automatically, the conclusions that feel obvious, the narratives that seem unquestionable. These are not neutral, they are active, and they are shaping the way you experience your life. To change this does not require forcing positivity or denying difficulty. It requires awareness, the kind of awareness that notices language as it is being used, that recognizes when a phrase is reinforcing something you no longer wish to continue and gently redirects it without resistance. Because the goal is not to replace one rigid statement with another. It is to open space. When language becomes more precise, more intentional, more aligned with possibility rather than repetition, something begins to shift. Not instantly, but consistently. Because the patterns you reinforce begin to change. And when the patterns change, what you notice changes. And when what you notice changes, what you experience begins to follow. The voice you carry with you is not neutral. It is one of the most powerful instruments you have. Not because it controls reality, but because it participates in shaping how reality is perceived, interpreted, and responded to. So from this point forward, something simple becomes possible. To speak with awareness, not perfectly, not constantly, but intentionally. To recognize that each word carries direction, that each phrase reinforces something, that each description shapes perception. And in that recognition, something shifts. Language is no longer automatic. It becomes deliberate, not forced, but chosen. Because in the end, what you repeat, you reinforce. And what you reinforce, you begin to live inside of. So the question is no longer whether words matter. The question is whether you are willing to notice what yours are creating. Because the world you move through tomorrow is already being shaped by the way you are speaking today. Chapter 5. The unified field and the power of intention. The reason your intentions collapse is not because you lack desire. It is because what you want and what you are do not agree with each other. Albert Einstein spent the last 30 years of his life pursuing something that many around him considered almost impossible, a unified field theory that could mathematically demonstrate that the four fundamental forces of the universe, gravity, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force, and the weak nuclear force, were not separate forces at all, but different expressions of a single underlying field. He did not complete that work in his lifetime. But the direction he pointed toward did not end there. Theoretical physics, especially through quantum field theory and later developments such as string theory, continued to move in that direction, suggesting something that carries both scientific and practical implications. That everything is connected, not metaphorically, physically. What appears separate at the level of your senses, the distance between you and another person, between you and an opportunity, between you and the life you are trying to create, is not absolute. It is constructed, a result of how your perception organizes information, not how reality is structured at its deepest level. At the quantum scale, separation dissolves. Everything exists within the same field. Everything interacts. Everything overlaps. A physicist who worked closely within this field of understanding described reality in a way that becomes difficult to ignore once you consider its implications, suggesting that what we perceive as separate objects are expressions of a deeper order, an underlying structure in which everything is already connected, even if that connection is not visible at the surface. He described reality as something similar to a hologram, where each part contains information about the whole, where nothing exists in isolation, even when it appears that way. If that is true, then something follows from it. Your intention is not confined to your mind. It is not something that begins and ends within your thoughts. It becomes a form of interaction with the field itself. There have been long-term experiments exploring this interaction, where systems designed to produce purely random outputs, sequences of numbers that should not be influenced by anything, showed small but statistically significant deviations when groups of people focused their attention and intention toward them. The effect observed was not large, but it was consistent. And consistency in this context matters more than magnitude. because even a small, repeatable influence suggests that consciousness is not isolated from physical systems. It interacts with them. From this perspective, intention is no longer something abstract. It becomes something measurable in its effects, even if those effects are subtle. But not all intention carries the same influence. Weak intention, the kind that shifts, hesitates, and dissolves at the first sign of resistance, produces minimal impact because it lacks coherence. It is divided, and division weakens signal. Strong intention is different. It does not come from wanting. It comes from alignment, from a state where thought, emotion, and internal condition move in the same direction without contradiction. This is the kind of intention that is not easily disrupted. Because it is not dependent on immediate results, it is sustained. Across different traditions, there have been practices designed to cultivate this kind of coherence, not through belief, but through direct experience, creating a state in which the separation between mind, body, and attention begins to dissolve, allowing intention to stabilize. Modern neuroscience has observed similar states where the brain enters patterns of synchronized activity, often described as higher frequency coherence, where different regions operate in alignment rather than conflict. In those moments, intention changes quality. It is no longer something you repeat, it becomes something you hold. And when intention is held in that way, it begins to interact differently with your experience. Not through force, but through organization. What you notice changes. What you choose changes. What you respond to changes. And over time, what you experience begins to reflect that shift. This is often misunderstood from the outside because the result appears as coincidence, as timing, as luck. But from within the process, it does not feel random. It feels consistent, as if something that has been sustained internally is now being reflected externally. There is a concept used to describe these moments, where internal state and external events align in ways that seem meaningful but are difficult to explain through linear cause and effect, suggesting that there is a deeper layer of reality where inner and outer are not separate processes, but expressions of the same underlying field. And when intention becomes coherent enough, sustained enough, aligned enough, it begins to operate within that layer. So the work is not to increase the number of things you want, it is to refine the quality of your intention, to move from fragmented desire to coherent direction, to reduce contradiction, to increase alignment. Because a divided intention weakens itself, but a coherent intention reinforces itself. This is where patience becomes essential. Not passive waiting, but steady consistency. Because what is coherent does not need urgency, it needs stability. When intention is aligned with your state, supported by your behavior, and sustained over time, it becomes something that interacts with your environment in a way that gradually reorganizes what you experience. Not instantly, not dramatically, but precisely. Which leads to a distinction that becomes increasingly clear. The difference between wishing and intending. One is unstable, the other is anchored. One changes with circumstance, the other remains. One asks, the other directs. And it is not what you ask for that shapes what follows. It is what you hold. Because what you hold consistently enough becomes the signal the field responds to. And that signal, whether you are aware of it or not, is always active. Chapter 6. The Trap of Urgency. The more desperate you feel for something to happen, the more you are training reality to delay it. At the center of what most people misunderstand about manifestation, there is a paradox that is almost invisible at first. Yet once it is seen clearly, it explains why so many individuals can practice techniques, repeat affirmations, visualize outcomes, and still find themselves standing in the same place months later, wondering why nothing has moved. The paradox is simple, but not comfortable. Urgency, which feels like intensity, like commitment, like proof that you truly want something, is in fact one of the most effective ways to prevent it from arriving. To understand this, it is necessary to look beyond the surface of urgency and examine what it actually carries within it. Because urgency is not neutral. It is not simply desire with speed. It is something else. It is desire contaminated by doubt. When you feel urgency, what you are really experiencing is not certainty that something will happen, but fear that it might not. Combined with the pressure of time, the sense that if it does not arrive quickly enough, something will be lost, something will be missed, something will not recover. And that emotional composition matters. Because what is being transmitted is not the image of what you want. It is the tension of not having it. And the field, as you have already seen, does not respond to your words. It responds to your state. From a deeper perspective, this creates a contradiction. You say you want something, but the emotional signal you sustain says it is not here, that it may not come, that it is uncertain. And that contradiction weakens the coherence of your intention. Not because the desire disappears, but because the signal becomes divided. Physics introduces an idea that, while often discussed in abstract terms, has a very direct implication here. At the quantum level, experiments have shown that particles can become entangled in such a way that a change in one is reflected in another instantly, regardless of distance, suggesting that at that level, the separation we perceive in space is not the same as the structure that actually exists. Some interpretations of this extend further, proposing that the constraints of time, the linear sequence of past, present, and future, may not apply in the same way at deeper levels of reality. If that is the case, then the timeline your mind insists on, the urgency of now, the demand that something must happen within a specific window, may not be aligned with how processes actually unfold. The mind operates in sequence. It measures, it compares, it expects, and when expectation is not met within the time frame it has constructed, it concludes that something is wrong, that the process is failing, that the system does not work. But the field does not operate according to that timeline. It responds to coherence, to alignment, to stability, not to impatience. This is something understood intuitively in ordinary life, even without scientific language. When you plant a seed, the process that follows is not visible in the way your mind would prefer. There is a period where nothing appears to happen. And if you interfere with that process, if you dig into the soil repeatedly to check whether growth has begun, you do not accelerate it. You interrupt it. Urgency behaves in the same way. It is the impulse to check, to force, to accelerate what requires stability. And in doing so, it disrupts what it is trying to produce. There are traditions that describe a different approach, not as passivity, but as a specific kind of action, one that is fully engaged, yet free from the tension of forcing outcomes, where effort is applied with precision and then released without attachment. This is often misunderstood. It is not inaction. It is not indifference. It is disciplined engagement without anxiety, the ability to act fully while not gripping the result. A farmer understands this. The work is done. The soil is prepared. The seed is planted. The conditions are maintained. But the farmer does not stand over the ground demanding growth. There is attention. There is care. There is consistency. But there is also trust. There is a story that illustrates this principle with unusual clarity. A certain type of bamboo, one of the fastest growing plants in the world, once it matures, shows no visible growth for the first 4 years after it is planted. Nothing. If you observe the soil during that time, it appears as if no progress is being made. And many would assume that the effort has failed. But during those years, something is happening beneath the surface. The plant is developing an extensive root system, expanding outward in all directions, building the structure that will support what is to come. And then, when that structure is complete, growth becomes rapid. In a matter of weeks, it can reach heights that seem impossible given what preceded it. From the outside, this looks like sudden success. But it is not sudden. It is the result of a process that was invisible until it was complete. And the same pattern appears in other areas of life. What you do not see does not mean nothing is happening. It means something is being prepared. When your intention is coherent, when your state is aligned, when your direction is stable, there are processes unfolding that you cannot yet observe. Connections forming, conditions organizing, interactions aligning, not randomly, but in response to what has been sustained. And urgency interferes with this, because urgency introduces doubt. It introduces tension. It disrupts coherence. There is, however, a way to move through this without falling into passivity. It involves shifting the emotional tone of your expectation, not waiting with anxiety, but holding with certainty. A form of anticipation that does not strain, that does not demand, but assumes, not because it has been proven, but because it is aligned. This is sometimes described as gratitude in advance, not as a performance, not as pretending, but as entering the emotional state of completion before the external confirmation appears. Not forcing belief, but stabilizing a condition, because the field responds to what is present, not to what is postponed. When this is practiced consistently, something changes. The urgency begins to dissolve. The need to check, to force, to accelerate, loses its intensity. And in its place, a different quality emerges, one that is quieter, more stable, more aligned. From that state, action becomes clearer, decisions become simpler, attention becomes more focused, not because everything is controlled, but because the internal contradiction has been reduced. So the instruction becomes simple, not easy, but clear. Release urgency, not by suppressing it, but by understanding what it carries. Act with precision, sustain your direction, and allow the process you have initiated to unfold without interference. Because what you are building may not yet be visible, but that does not mean it is not already in motion. Plant well, hold steady, and trust what you have aligned. Because the moment you stop digging up the seed is the moment it is finally allowed to grow. Chapter 7. The Alchemy of Pain. The deepest pain you have tried to avoid is the very thing that has been shaping the level at which your life can expand. If everything we have explored so far about frequency, intention, and alignment is true, then there is a question that cannot be avoided by anyone willing to think honestly. A question that does not allow easy answers and does not tolerate comforting simplifications. Why do people who are kind, generous, and seemingly aligned still suffer in ways that feel disproportionate? Losing what they love, facing illness, experiencing events that appear to contradict any idea of harmony or coherence? To answer this by saying that all suffering is the result of negative vibration is not only insufficient, it is careless, because it ignores the complexity of human experience and reduces something profound into something shallow. The real answer requires a different perspective, one that does not deny suffering, but understands its role. In physics, there is a principle that appears repeatedly when systems evolve toward higher levels of organization. A principle that suggests that before a system becomes more ordered, more complex, more stable, it must first pass through a phase of instability, a point where its existing structure breaks down, where it appears to collapse before reorganizing at a higher level. From within the system, this moment feels like disorder. From outside, it is transformation. When this is applied to human experience, something becomes clearer. Moments of intense disruption, loss, or pain are not always signs of failure or misalignment. They can also be moments where an old structure is no longer sufficient, where something deeper is being reorganized, even if that process feels like destruction while it is happening. If you look at individuals who have reached extraordinary levels of clarity, depth, or influence, you begin to notice a pattern that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Many of them have passed through periods of profound suffering, not as an obstacle to their development, but as part of it. Not because pain is required in a moral sense, but because pain has a way of forcing a level of confrontation that comfort does not. There are accounts from individuals who have endured extreme conditions where survival was uncertain and suffering was constant, and within those conditions, something unexpected was observed. The people who endured were not always the strongest physically. They were often the ones who were able to find meaning within what they were experiencing, who were able to relate to their situation in a way that preserved something essential within them. Because meaning changes how pain is processed. It does not remove it, but it transforms its function. This is where the idea of transformation becomes precise. Pain by itself does not elevate. Unprocessed pain accumulates, it settles. It becomes tension within the body, distortion within perception, a pattern that continues to repeat because it has not been understood. Avoided pain does not disappear, it persists in another form. The first phase of transformation, then, is contact, not analysis, not avoidance, but direct contact. The willingness to feel what is there without immediately reaching for distraction, without numbing it through activity, without escaping into anything that reduces its intensity, without resolving it. Because what is not felt remains active. It continues to influence the state you carry. The second phase requires a different kind of movement, not away from the pain, but into inquiry. Not the question that seeks to assign blame or justify suffering, but the question that opens meaning. Not why is this happening to me, but what is this revealing to me? What pattern does this expose? What assumption does this challenge? What has this shown that comfort never would have revealed? When that question is asked without resistance, something shifts. Because the mind is designed to search for meaning. And when it searches with openness, rather than defense, it begins to find connections, insights, structures that were previously hidden. Not immediately, but consistently. The third phase is where transformation becomes visible. Not because the pain disappears, but because it changes form. What was once experienced as loss becomes understanding. What was once confusion becomes clarity. What was once weakness becomes capacity. Because what has been integrated becomes part of your structure. This is not abstract. You can see it in people who have lived through difficulty and emerged with a depth that cannot be simulated. Someone who has experienced failure and reflected on it carries a form of understanding that cannot be taught in theory. Someone who has gone through loss and allowed themselves to fully process it often carries a presence that creates deeper connection, not because they are trying to, but because something within them has expanded. Pain, when it is processed, does not diminish you. It refines you. It stretches your capacity. And in doing so, it allows you to operate at a level that would not have been accessible otherwise. There is an image that captures this clearly. A string, when it is loose, produces little sound. But when it is stretched to the right tension, it begins to resonate. Not because it was left untouched, but because it was pulled, adjusted, brought into a state where vibration becomes possible. In the same way, what you have gone through, if you engage with it consciously, becomes part of what allows you to operate differently. Not despite the cost, but because of it. This does not mean that suffering is required. It means that when suffering occurs, it does not have to remain what it was. It can be used, not in a forced way, not in a way that denies what it felt like, but in a way that allows it to become something else. Because the difference is not in what happened. It is in what is done with it. And what is done with it determines whether it remains a wound or becomes a source of strength. So the question is not whether you have experienced pain. You have. The question is whether that pain is still sitting inside you as something unresolved, or whether it has been transformed into something that expands what you are capable of becoming. Because what you carry forward is not the event. It is what you made of it. And that is where everything changes. Chapter 8, the magnetism of certainty. What you call waiting for it to happen is often the quiet signal that you don't believe it will. There is a quality shared by every individual who has brought something extraordinary into their reality, regardless of culture, belief system, or intellectual background, and it is often misunderstood because it is mistaken for something else. It is not positivity. It is not enthusiasm. It is not even faith in the conventional sense. It is certainty. Certainty is not loud. It does not try to convince. It does not fluctuate depending on circumstances. It is stable. Hope, on the other hand, carries a different texture. Hope says, maybe it will happen. Hope waits. Hope watches. Hope depends on what comes next. Certainty does not. Certainty says, it is. Not in a way that denies reality, but in a way that is already aligned with a deeper level of it. And that difference, although subtle in language, produces radically different effects in the field you emit. When a person operates from hope, there is hesitation, a slight delay in movement, a need for confirmation. But when a person operates from certainty, something else appears: clarity, directness, an absence of internal negotiation. And this is not only perceived by others, it is felt. Research into human behavior has shown that certainty communicates itself beyond words through posture, rhythm, tone, and the absence of doubt. And that observers respond to it instinctively, not because of what is being said, but because of how it is being carried. But what operates between people has a deeper extension. Because certainty is not only social, it is structural. A coherent internal state produces a coherent signal. And coherence, as you have already seen, is what organizes interaction with the environment. When the signal is stable, the response becomes more stable. Not instantly, but consistently. This leads to the question that inevitably arises: how can certainty exist when there is no evidence? How can someone feel aligned with an outcome that has not yet appeared? How can certainty be maintained when the current situation seems to contradict it? The answer is not intuitive, because certainty is not built from evidence. It precedes it. If certainty depends on proof, then it is not certainty. It is reaction. It is the mind agreeing with what has already happened, and that has no creative influence. Genuine certainty is internal. It is chosen. It is practiced. It is cultivated before anything appears to confirm it. And this is where most people stop, because they are waiting for something external to justify an internal state. But consider how a scientist approaches a hypothesis. There are moments where an idea is fully formed internally, where its logic is complete, where its structure is clear, yet there is no immediate way to test it. No instruments, no data, no confirmation. And yet, the scientist does not abandon it. Not because of belief, but because of coherence. Einstein developed the framework of general relativity in 1915, long before it could be tested. And it was not until 1919, during a solar eclipse observed by Arthur Eddington, that its predictions were confirmed. For 4 years, there was no external proof, and yet the internal certainty remained, not as arrogance, but as alignment with something understood deeply enough that time was no longer a question, only process. This is the relationship you must develop with your own vision. Not forcing belief, but reaching a level of internal clarity where external confirmation becomes secondary. Not because it is irrelevant, but because it is inevitable once the internal structure is stable. To build this, you do not begin with abstraction. You begin with memory, not as nostalgia, but as evidence. Look at your own life carefully. There are moments, both small and significant, where something you intended, something you moved toward, something you aligned with, eventually took form. Opportunities that appeared at unexpected times. People who entered your life when they were needed. Situations that shifted when everything seemed fixed. These are not random. They are patterns, and those patterns matter because they show that alignment has already worked through you before, that you are not starting from zero, that you have already participated in this process, even if you did not recognize it at the time. When certainty is built on that foundation, it changes quality. It is no longer borrowed. It is no longer dependent on external reassurance. It becomes grounded. And what is grounded does not fluctuate easily. From that point, certainty is not something you try to feel. It is something you stop contradicting. Because contradiction weakens it, doubt fragments it, and clarity stabilizes it. When certainty is present, decisions become simpler. Movement becomes more direct. Attention becomes more focused. Not because everything is controlled, but because the internal signal is no longer divided. And over time, that consistency begins to organize what you experience. Not dramatically, but precisely. This is why certainty acts as magnetism, not as an abstract idea, but as a structural principle, because what is stable attracts what aligns with it. So the work is not to convince yourself, it is to align yourself, to build certainty from your own experience, to stabilize it, to remove contradiction, and to hold it without needing immediate proof. Because what you are certain of, you stop questioning. And what you stop questioning begins to take form, not because you forced it, but because you aligned with it. And in the end, it is not what you hope for that shapes your reality. It is what you know before it becomes visible, because that is what you hold. And what you hold is what everything else begins to follow. Chapter 9. The art of letting go without giving up. The harder you try to force the outcome, the further you push it away. The most persistent contradiction in the practice of conscious manifestation appears at a point where most people begin to feel tension, because it asks for two things that seem incompatible at first glance: a complete commitment to a vision, and at the same time, a complete release of attachment to how and when that vision will take form. To hold something deeply while not gripping it. To move towards something with clarity while not forcing its path. To care fully without becoming dependent on the outcome. At first, this feels impossible, as if you are being asked to move in two opposite directions at once. And yet, across traditions that have endured for centuries, this paradox appears again and again, not as a contradiction to be solved, but as a threshold to be crossed. Because this is where the difference emerges between those who accumulate techniques and those who begin to see results. There is an idea in physics that offers a useful way to understand this. At the smallest scales, when attempting to measure certain properties of a particle, increasing precision in one dimension reduces clarity in another, as if fixing one aspect too rigidly limits what else can exist. Not because the system becomes simpler, but because it becomes constrained. Something similar happens in manifestation. When you become attached to a very specific form of outcome, a particular person, a precise opportunity, an exact amount, delivered in a fixed time frame, you narrow the field of possibilities into a single path. And that path, while familiar to your mind, may not be the most effective one available, because the perspective you operate from is limited, not flawed, but incomplete. The field you are interacting with does not share that limitation. It operates across connections you cannot fully see, through pathways you cannot map in advance, aligning conditions in ways that often only make sense in retrospect. And when your attention becomes rigid, insisting that things must unfold in one specific way, you reduce the space for other possibilities to emerge. Imagine a navigator crossing an ocean with a clear destination and a planned route. The map is prepared, the course is set, the timing is calculated. But once the journey begins, conditions shift. The wind changes, currents move differently than expected. An inexperienced navigator resists, holding tightly to the original course, fighting the current, forcing direction, and in doing so, expends energy, slows progress, and increases strain. A skilled navigator does something else. The destination remains, but the path adjusts. The sails shift. The current is used rather than opposed. And as a result, the journey becomes more efficient, not because the plan was abandoned, but because it was adapted. Sometimes this leads to an unexpected outcome, a different port, a different opportunity, something that was not part of the original plan. But often that difference carries something the original path could not have provided. This is the essence of detachment, not indifference, not passivity, but flexibility. The ability to hold the vision without locking it into a single form. To practice this, 3 elements become important. The first is clarity about what matters, not in terms of specific objects or events, but in terms of experience. What kind of life? What kind of feeling? What kind of impact? What kind of presence? Clarity at this level creates direction without rigidity. The second is action, but not forced action, not movement driven by urgency or fear. Action that emerges from alignment, from a state where the internal condition is stable enough to produce clear impulses, where what you do feels connected to where you are going. Forced action creates resistance. It feels heavy. It requires constant effort. Inspired action flows. It adjusts. It sustains itself. The third is awareness, not constant monitoring, not anxious checking, but periodic clarity, returning to the vision, not to control it, but to keep it alive, to ensure it remains aligned with what you are becoming. There is a difference between tending something and controlling it. Tending supports growth, controlling restricts it, and knowing that difference changes how you relate to the process. Letting go, in this context, is not giving up. It is releasing the need to dictate every detail. It is trusting that once the direction is clear and the alignment is present, the path does not need to be forced into a specific shape, because what you are working with is not limited to what you can see, and what is available may exceed what you have imagined. This is why the practice feels advanced, because it requires both discipline and flexibility, both clarity and openness, both direction and release. And when these are held together, something changes. The tension reduces. The process becomes smoother. Not because effort disappears, but because resistance does. At that point, movement becomes more efficient, decisions become more natural, and outcomes begin to organize in ways that feel less forced and more aligned. So the work is not to loosen your commitment, it is to loosen your grip on form, to remain clear about where you are going, but open about how you arrive. Because what you are holding is not a single path, it is a direction. And when you allow that direction to move through multiple possibilities, something becomes available that rigidity could never reach. Let go of control, not of vision. Act with clarity, without force. Return to your direction, without obsession. Because mastery begins at the moment you stop trying to control everything and start allowing what is aligned to unfold. Chapter 10. The Invisible Blockers. Why does your life stay the same, even after you understand exactly what to change? If you have reached this point, if you understand frequency, if you have practiced aligning your state, if you have tried to hold intention with clarity and still find yourself returning to the same outcomes, then the answer is not on the surface. It is almost certainly hidden beneath it, because there are mechanisms that do not announce themselves, patterns that do not appear in conscious thought, forces that operate quietly below awareness and yet influence every result you try to create. These are the invisible blockers, and until they are seen, no technique, no matter how refined, will produce consistent change. The first is unconscious systemic loyalty. Within every family system, there are patterns that extend beyond what is spoken or remembered, patterns of limitation, struggle, success, sacrifice, that are carried forward without conscious choice. A person may desire to move beyond the conditions they were born into, to create abundance where there was lack, yet at a deeper level hold an unspoken belief that to surpass those who came before is a form of betrayal. And so, without realizing it, they resist their own progress. Not because they lack desire, but because at a deeper level, their limitation feels like loyalty. The second blocker is the protected identity. Your mind has constructed a coherent sense of who you are based on your past, your habits, your limitations, your history. And even when that identity is painful, it is familiar. The brain, as a system designed for survival, prefers known discomfort to unknown possibility. When you begin to change, when your state begins to shift, resistance appears. Not as a clear refusal, but as delay, distraction, hesitation, self-sabotage, precisely at the moment progress begins, because the system is trying to return to what it recognizes. The third blocker is unresolved emotional charge. Emotions that are not fully processed do not disappear. They remain in the body as tension, as memory, as frequency. Resentment that was never released, guilt that was never faced, grief that was never fully felt, these do not fade with time. They continue to influence how you perceive, how you respond, what you expect. They act like interference, distorting the signal you send into the field. The fourth blocker is conflict of values. Sometimes what you consciously want contradicts what you unconsciously believe. A person may desire financial success while associating wealth with loss of integrity. They may seek visibility while associating attention with danger. This creates a divided system, where one part moves forward and another pulls back. The result is inconsistency, progress followed by collapse, opportunity followed by withdrawal. These blockers do not operate separately. They reinforce each other, and because they exist below awareness, they are often mistaken for external problems, bad timing, lack of opportunity, unfavorable conditions. But the pattern remains the same. This is why surface-level change does not last. You can adjust behavior, repeat new thoughts, apply techniques, but if the underlying structure remains unchanged, the system returns to its previous state. Not immediately, but inevitably. To change this requires a different kind of work. Not more effort, but more depth. The willingness to examine what you have not questioned, to bring awareness to what has been operating silently, to understand not only what you want, but what within you resists it. There are ways to approach this, looking at the parts of yourself you avoid, understanding the patterns you inherited, processing emotions that were never fully integrated, clarifying the values that guide your decisions beneath awareness. Because what is hidden continues to act, and what is unexamined continues to repeat. A tree that bears no fruit does not need more attention on its leaves. It requires someone willing to look at its roots. The invisible blockers are those roots. And the moment you are willing to look beneath the surface is the moment real change becomes possible. Chapter 11. The geometry of relations. You can never sustainably operate at a higher level than the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. This statement has been repeated so often that it risks being dismissed as a motivational cliche. Yet when examined through the lens of neuroscience and human physiology, it reveals itself not as opinion, but as mechanism. Your environment is not something you observe from a distance. It is something your nervous system continuously absorbs, mirrors, and integrates. The discovery of mirror neurons by Italian neuroscientist Giacomo Rizzolatti at the University of Parma made this process visible in a way that had never been clearly understood before. These neurons activate not only when you perform an action, but also when you observe another person performing it. In other words, the boundary between observing and becoming is far thinner than it appears. When you spend extended periods of time around someone, your brain is not simply registering their behavior. It is simulating it. Their emotional patterns, their reactions to stress, their way of interpreting events are being rehearsed within your own system. Your body begins to internalize their state with the same precision that an actor internalizes a role. And what you rehearse repeatedly becomes familiar. What becomes familiar becomes automatic. And what becomes automatic becomes who you are without effort. This is why intention alone is not enough. Because even if you decide to elevate your thinking, even if you attempt to stabilize a new frequency, if the relational environment you are immersed in consistently reinforces a different pattern, that pattern will gradually override your conscious effort. If you are surrounded by chronic complaint, your system learns complaint. If you are immersed in subtle cynicism, your perception begins to filter reality through that lens. If scarcity is the dominant tone of your environment, your body begins to operate as if scarcity were a fact, not a perspective. And this does not happen suddenly. It happens quietly, through repetition. This does not mean you must distance yourself from people who are struggling. Compassion is not incompatible with growth. In fact, it is one of the highest forms of coherence a human being can maintain. But it does require awareness, because there is a difference between being present with someone and unconsciously adopting their state. The question is not who you care about. The question is what you allow to shape you. There are theories that attempt to describe this phenomenon beyond individual interaction. Biologist Rupert Sheldrake introduced the concept of morphic fields, suggesting that groups of beings connected through shared identity or repeated interaction participate in a common informational field that influences behavior and learning. While aspects of his theory remain debated, the underlying observation finds strong support in social psychology and neuroscience. Individuals within a group influence each other in ways that extend far beyond conscious communication. Relationships are not just exchanges of ideas. They are shared fields of resonance. When two people interact deeply, something synchronizes. Emotional rhythms align, patterns of thought converge. Even physiological states begin to reflect each other. This is why certain conversations leave you clearer, more energized, more stable, while others leave you drained, confused, or subtly diminished. Not because of what was said, but because of what was transmitted. From a practical perspective, this creates two directions of work. The first is a relational audit. Not dramatic, not judgmental, but honest. When you leave an interaction with someone in your life, what is the state you carry with you? Are you more focused, more certain, more aligned? Or are you more scattered, more doubtful, more fatigued? This is not about labeling people. It is about recognizing influence. The second is the deliberate construction of a resonant environment. Not in a manipulative way, but with clarity, seeking out and cultivating relationships with individuals whose state reflects where you are moving toward. Because those individuals become mirrors, not of your current condition, but of your potential. And that mirror is one of the most powerful calibration tools available. When you spend time with people who already operate at a level you are trying to reach, you do not need to imagine what it feels like. You begin to experience it directly. Your system adapts, your baseline shifts, not through effort, but through exposure. This is why relationships are not secondary to your development. They are structural. They define the field within which your transformation either stabilizes or dissolves. So the work is not to withdraw from the world. It is to become intentional about proximity, to understand that who you are around is not neutral. It is formative, because over time, your frequency will not rise to your aspirations. It will settle into your environment. And the moment you become conscious of that is the moment you begin to choose it. Chapter 12, the body as an antenna. If your body is still living in tension, fatigue, and contradiction, no thought you repeat will be strong enough to override it. Spirituality that ignores the body becomes abstract, detached, something that sounds true but does not translate into consistent results. And any attempt at manifestation that treats the body as secondary remains unstable because the body is not a passive container for your mind. It is the instrument through which your state becomes real, not metaphorically, but functionally. The body is the antenna through which your personal field interacts with the larger field of possibilities, translating what you think and feel into patterns that can be sustained over time. For a long time, biology was understood through a simple model. DNA determines everything. But research in cellular biology began to challenge that assumption. Dr. Bruce Lipton demonstrated that cells do not simply obey DNA in isolation. They respond to signals from their environment. And for the cells in your body, the most immediate environment is the internal chemical state created by your thoughts and emotions. Lipton described how the cell membrane acts as an interface, receiving signals and determining how genetic expression unfolds. This is the basis of epigenetics, the understanding that genes are not fixed commands, but responsive systems that change depending on the signals they receive. In practical terms, your body is not waiting for reality to change before it responds. It is already responding to the state you are sustaining. This shifts everything. Because your body is not just experiencing your thoughts, it is translating them into biology. Hormones, neurotransmitters, breathing patterns, and heart rhythms begin to align with the state you carry most consistently. And once that state is embodied, it becomes more stable than any isolated thought, because it is reinforced continuously through physical processes. Your body becomes a broadcasting system, not something you turn on and off, but something that is always transmitting. There are three primary ways this transmission occurs: breathing, movement, and posture. Breathing exists at the intersection of automatic and voluntary control. It continues without your attention, yet it can also be directed consciously. Practices such as pranayama in yoga or coherence breathing studied by the HeartMath Institute have shown measurable effects on the nervous system. When breathing becomes slow and rhythmic, the heart's electromagnetic field becomes more coherent. A simple pattern, inhaling for 4 seconds and exhaling for 4 to 6 seconds for about 10 minutes, can shift your internal state in a way comparable to much longer periods of passive meditation. Movement is the second channel, but not movement as distraction or mechanical exercise. Movement with awareness activates chemical signals that correspond to specific states. Dopamine supports direction and motivation. Serotonin stabilizes confidence. Endorphins expand energy and resilience. These are not abstract ideas. They are biological processes that shape how you feel and how you act. Posture is the third channel, often overlooked because it appears external. But posture is how your body organizes itself in relation to your environment. Research by psychologist Amy Cuddy at Harvard showed that holding open, upright postures for just 2 minutes can produce measurable changes in hormone levels, increasing testosterone linked to confidence and reducing cortisol linked to stress. Taken together, these elements reveal something simple. Your body does not lie about your state, and it does not wait for your thoughts to become consistent before it acts. It reflects what you repeat. If your thoughts say one thing, but your breathing is shallow, your posture closed, your movements tense, the signal becomes mixed, and a mixed signal produces inconsistent results. But when the body is engaged deliberately, when breathing is steady, posture aligned, movement intentional, something changes. The state becomes coherent, and coherence strengthens the signal. This is why the body is not secondary in this process. It is central, because it is the only part of you that operates continuously in the present moment. Your thoughts may shift, your attention may drift, but your body is always active, always responding, always transmitting. Think of it like tuning an instrument. You can understand the music, you can imagine the sound, but until the instrument is tuned, the note will not match the intention. Your body is that instrument, and the work is not to force it, but to tune it, through breath, through movement, through posture. Because when the instrument is aligned, the signal becomes clear. And when the signal is clear, what you are holding internally begins to take form externally with far greater consistency. Use the body not as something you carry, but as the precise instrument it has always been. Chapter 13. The Law of the Creative Void. Nothing new is entering your life because there is nowhere for it to land. Before anything takes form, there is always a space that allows it. Before stars ignite, there is the vast quiet of the cosmos. Before a musician plays the first note, there is silence. Before an architect draws the first line, there is the untouched surface of a blank page. This is not poetry. It is structure. For something new to emerge, something else must not be there. Physics describes this in a way that contradicts how most people think about emptiness. The vacuum, what we imagine as empty space, is not empty at all. It is the lowest energy state of a system, yet it contains an immense field of potential. Physicists like Richard Feynman describe the energy contained in what appears to be empty space as so vast that even a small portion of it holds unimaginable capacity. What looks like nothing is actually everything waiting. This is the same principle expressed long before modern physics, when Lao Tzu described how the usefulness of a wheel lies not in its spokes, but in the empty space at its center, how the usefulness of a room lies not in its walls, but in the space those walls create. Emptiness is not lack, it is function. Now bring this into your life. Look honestly at how you are living. How much space is there in your day, in your environment, in your mind? Or have you filled every available space with activity, with noise, with obligations, with thoughts that repeat without resolution? Most people wait for something new to arrive while maintaining a life that has no room for it. They ask for change, but protect everything that prevents it. It is like expecting a guest to arrive when every room is already occupied. Nothing new can enter a full system. Creating space is not an abstract idea. It has dimensions. The first is physical space, the removal of what no longer serves. Objects, commitments, environments that belong to a version of you that is no longer active. The Japanese concept of ma captures this precisely, the meaningful space between things that allows each element to exist with clarity. Without space, everything blends into noise. The second is mental space, not the absence of thinking, but the interruption of compulsive thought. The ability to create moments where the mind is not constantly processing, analyzing, reacting. This is where meditation becomes functional, not as relaxation, but as a way to access what exists beneath the noise. Because clarity does not emerge from constant activity, it emerges from stillness. The third is relational space. Even meaningful relationships require space to remain alive. When interaction becomes constant, predictable, saturated with routine, depth begins to disappear. Distance, when used consciously, restores presence. It allows connection to renew rather than decay into habit. The fourth is time. Time without structure, without immediate purpose, without output. This is the dimension most people eliminate first, replacing it with constant productivity. But the cost of that elimination is not efficiency, it is insight. Because the ideas that change direction rarely appear when you are forcing them. They appear when you are not. Moments that seem unproductive often carry the highest value. A quiet walk, standing under open sky, sitting without distraction. These are not empty moments. They are open fields where something new can appear. Some of the most important insights in history emerged in these states. Newton observing an apple fall while resting. Archimedes realizing displacement in a moment of stillness. Einstein developing early ideas while working in an environment that allowed long stretches of uninterrupted thought. Not in intensity, in space. This is what most people misunderstand. They think progress comes from adding more effort, more input, more activity. But transformation often begins with removal, with clearing, with making space. Because what you are seeking does not need more pressure, it needs room. Emptiness is not wasted time. It is the condition that allows something new to take form. It is the space where possibility becomes accessible. So the work is simple, not easy, but clear. Remove what is no longer aligned. Create space where there was none. Allow silence where there was noise. Because what is meant to enter your life is not blocked by lack of effort. It is blocked by lack of space. Create the void, and what has been waiting will finally have somewhere to arrive. Chapter 14. The speed of gratitude. The fastest way to change your life is to stop asking for more and start feeling like nothing is missing. If there were one practice, one tool among everything you have encountered so far that could shift your internal state more quickly and with less resistance than anything else, it would not be visualization, not discipline, not even intention in its most structured form. It would be gratitude, not as a polite gesture, not as a habit of listing what sounds good, but as a state a condition that is felt, not performed. Gratitude, when it is genuine, does something very specific inside the body. It is not abstract, it is measurable. At the biochemical level, it triggers the release of dopamine and serotonin, the same neurotransmitters associated with reward, anticipation, and a sense of safety. When your brain enters this state, it does not interpret it as neutral. It interprets it as confirmation, as if something good has already happened, as if the environment is supportive, as if what you need is available. And once that interpretation is established, another mechanism activates. The reticular activating system begins to filter reality differently, seeking evidence that matches that state. You begin to notice opportunities, recognize signals you previously ignored, and respond in new ways. That response leads to different outcomes, which then reinforce the original state. This is how a cycle forms. Gratitude produces a state. That state shapes perception. Perception shapes action, and action shapes results, which return and strengthen the state again. At the neurological level, this effect is not temporary. Research by Robert Emmons at the University of California, Davis has shown that consistent practice of gratitude produces structural changes in the brain. Networks associated with resilience, positive expectation, and emotional stability become stronger over time. After about 3 weeks of consistent practice, measurable changes appear in brain activity related to well-being and motivation. At the level of the body's electromagnetic activity, similar effects appear. Research from the HeartMath Institute shows that genuine gratitude produces one of the most coherent heart states measurable. And coherence, as you have already seen, strengthens the signal your system emits into the environment. But gratitude also changes something more subtle. It changes your relationship with time. The field you interact with does not separate past, present, and future the way your mind does. It responds to state. When you feel gratitude for something that has not yet appeared physically but already exists in your intention, you are not pretending. You are aligning. There's a difference between asking and acknowledging. Asking reinforces absence. Acknowledging reinforces presence. This is why traditions across cultures have emphasized gratitude not as a request, but as recognition. Not give me, but thank you. Because one state says it is missing, and the other says it already exists. To apply this, the practice is simple. The first part is gratitude for the past. Choose a difficult experience and identify what it created, what it forced you to learn, what it built in you. Not forcing gratitude for the pain, but recognizing the growth it produced. The second part is gratitude for the present. Choose a few elements of your current life, including something you usually overlook, and give it full attention for a short moment. Not casually, but with presence. The third part is anticipatory gratitude. Choose one element of what you are moving toward and experience it as already real, with emotional clarity and detail, as if it were happening now. This is not performance. It is calibration, because the state you create internally becomes the signal you sustain. The entire process requires very little time, only a few minutes, yet its effect compounds because it works across multiple systems at once: biological, neurological, and perceptual. This is why gratitude moves quickly. Not because it is mystical, but because it aligns multiple layers of your system at the same time. So the shift is simple. Stop waiting for something to happen before allowing yourself to feel complete. Because the moment you feel complete, everything begins to organize differently around you. Gratitude is not the result. It is the starting point. And when it is genuine, it accelerates everything that follows. Chapter 15, The Paradox of Competition. Every time you feel threatened by someone else's success, you are training your own reality to shrink. The most destructive mindset a person seeking abundance can carry is not laziness, not lack of discipline, not even lack of clarity. It is the belief that another person's success reduces the space available for your own. This is the logic of competitive scarcity, and it is so deeply embedded in modern culture that most people never stop to examine it. They operate as if life were a limited resource, as if opportunity were something to be divided, as if for one person to rise, another must fall. This model may describe certain markets at specific moments in history, but it does not describe reality at its deepest level. A more accurate metaphor is simple: the sun. When sunlight reaches millions of people at once, it does not divide itself into smaller portions. It does not weaken because others are receiving it. It radiates outward, and each person receives fully. Light does not compete, it expands. If the universe is understood not as a closed system of fixed resources, but as a field of energy and information that continuously generates new possibilities, then the idea that success is limited begins to dissolve. Because what is being accessed is not a fixed quantity, but a field of potential. Physicist David Bohm proposed that reality contains an underlying order in which everything is interconnected, suggesting that creativity is not the extraction of something scarce, but the unfolding of something already present. From this perspective, ideas do not run out, possibilities do not diminish, they expand as they are expressed. This becomes clear when you look at history. Every major scientific discovery did not reduce what remained to be discovered. It opened new questions. Every significant work of art did not exhaust creativity. It expanded what could be imagined. Every transformative enterprise did not consume opportunity. It created more of it. And yet, at the level of personal experience, something else often takes over. Comparison, followed by envy. Envy is not just an emotion, it is a signal. When you experience it, your system interprets another person's success as a threat. Your body shifts into a defensive state, and that state changes what you project outward. Instead of expansion, there is contraction. Instead of openness, there is protection. From that position, your focus changes. You stop creating and start comparing. You stop expanding and start guarding. And over time, this reinforces the very scarcity you are reacting to. The alternative is not to pretend to feel differently. It is to understand what you are actually seeing. The success you observe in others is not taking something away from you. It is evidence that what you desire exists. It is proof that the field is active. From this perspective, another person's success becomes information, a signal, a demonstration, not something to compete with, but something that confirms possibility. This shift changes your internal state, because when you recognize abundance as something that already exists, your system opens. And that openness changes how you perceive, how you act, and what you notice. There are individuals throughout history who have embodied this understanding, not as a tactic, but as a natural response. They recognized that celebrating the success of others did not weaken them. It aligned them with the same pattern. Andrew Carnegie, who rose from poverty to become one of the most influential industrialists of his time, described this clearly. When he saw others prosper, he did not feel threatened. He felt a kind of personal satisfaction, as if their success demonstrated that prosperity was available to anyone who applied the right principles. This is the difference between seeing success as competition and seeing it as confirmation. Because the state you hold in relation to others shapes the field you operate within. If you see others as competitors, you enter a system of limitation. If you see others as evidence, you enter a system of expansion. Over time, that distinction becomes visible, not immediately, but consistently. So the shift is not to avoid comparison, it is to transform what it means. To move from reaction to recognition, from contraction to expansion. Because the question is not how much is available, it is how you are relating to what already exists. And the moment you stop seeing others as a threat, your own space begins to open. Not because anything was taken from them, but because nothing was ever limited to begin with. Chapter 16, The Power of Transcendent Purpose. Why do some people barely push and reality seems to move for them, while others exhaust themselves and nothing changes? There is a difference in the kind of state generated by a person pursuing something only for personal gain and a person driven by a purpose that extends beyond themselves. This difference is not primarily moral, it is structural. It changes the quality of the signal being sustained, and that change alters what becomes possible. Viktor Frankl, whose work emerged from the extreme conditions of concentration camps, observed something that challenged conventional assumptions about survival. The individuals who endured were not always the strongest, nor those in the most favorable circumstances. They were those who had something that extended beyond their immediate situation, a reason to continue, a connection, a task, a meaning that gave direction to their experience. Purpose, in that context, was not comfort, it was force. Modern psychology has examined this further. Martin Seligman, through his work on well-being, identified meaning as one of the core elements that sustain long-term resilience. Not as an abstract idea, but as something that changes how individuals respond to difficulty, how they interpret events, and how they continue when conditions become unstable. But beyond psychological resilience, there is another dimension: the effect that purpose has on the state you generate. When your intention is centered only on personal outcome, the system operates within a limited frame. The signal is narrow. It is contained within your own immediate concerns. But when what you are creating extends beyond you, when it includes others, when it contributes in some way beyond your own experience, something expands. The signal changes. Neuroscience has shown that when individuals act from a genuine sense of contribution, different regions of the brain become active. Areas associated with cooperation, trust, and long-term reward engagement show increased activity, while stress-related responses decrease. The system becomes more stable, more sustained. At the level of the heart's electromagnetic activity, similar patterns appear. Coherence becomes stronger and more consistent when the underlying state is aligned with a broader purpose. From a field perspective, this creates amplification, because an intention that includes others does not remain isolated. It connects with a wider network. The effect is not only internal, it extends outward, interacting with a larger range of conditions, responses, and possibilities. The difference can be understood simply. A candle produces light. A lighthouse also produces light. But the lighthouse is structured to guide others, and that structure changes its impact. The same element becomes more powerful because of the purpose it serves. This does not mean that personal goals are invalid. The desire for stability, for growth, for improvement is natural. But when those desires are connected to something beyond personal benefit, when they become part of a larger direction, their effect changes. Not in intensity, but in reach. Because what you are sustaining internally is no longer limited to your own experience. It begins to include others, and that inclusion expands the field you are operating within. So the question is not whether you want more. It is what that more allows. Who is affected by it? What changes because of it? When your intention includes that dimension, something shifts. Your effort becomes more consistent. Your state becomes more stable. And your perception begins to align with opportunities that reflect that broader direction. This is not a technique. It is a reorientation. Because the system responds differently when the signal you are sustaining is not only about acquisition, but about contribution. So the work here is simple. Look at what you are moving toward and ask what it extends into, what it makes possible beyond you. Because the moment your purpose expands, your field does the same. And what you are able to access begins to reflect that expansion. Chapter 17, The Architecture of Sacred Time. The problem isn't that you don't have time, it's that the way you live it is quietly working against everything you want. Time is the most evenly distributed resource in existence. Every person, regardless of position, wealth, or circumstance, receives the same 24 hours each day. And yet, the difference in outcomes between individuals is not marginal. It is extreme. Which means the variable is not time itself. It is how that time is lived. Modern physics introduces an idea that challenges how time is usually understood. What you experience as a steady flow from past to future is not as stable as it appears. Carlo Rovelli, in his work on the nature of time, argues that time does not exist as a single uniform current. Its perception depends on the observer. At deeper levels of physical reality, time behaves less like a constant and more like something that emerges from interaction. This is not abstract philosophy. It has direct implications. Because if time is not fixed in the way it feels, then your experience of it is not fixed either. Which means the real question is not how much time you have. It is what state you are inhabiting while you move through it. A person who constantly experiences time as insufficient, as something they are behind on, as something that is running out, is not just thinking that way. They are generating a state. And that state becomes the dominant tone of their day. And that tone spreads. Because the feeling of not enough time is not isolated. It is structurally similar to not enough money, not enough opportunity, not enough connection. It is one frequency expressed in different forms. Scarcity. When that state is repeated throughout the day, it does not remain confined to scheduling. It becomes identity. The architecture of sacred time begins here, not with productivity, but with awareness. Because the goal is not to compress more activity into fewer hours. It is to design your time in a way that sustains the state you want to operate from. There are moments in your day when your clarity is higher, when your energy is stable, when your attention is not fragmented. These moments are not equal to the rest. They are leverage points. Research on flow states, particularly through the work of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, has shown that when a person is fully immersed in a task, when attention is complete and uninterrupted, the output generated in a single hour can exceed what would normally require multiple hours of distracted effort. But more than productivity, flow represents coherence, a state where the boundary between effort and action becomes thin, where movement feels direct, where resistance decreases. This is where time changes quality, because an hour in that state is not experienced the same way as an hour spent fragmented, and over time, those differences accumulate. To work with this, time needs structure, not rigid control, but intentional design. The first element is how you begin. The first part of the day sets the tone for everything that follows. If that time is immediately filled with external input, messages, news, demands, then your state is defined from the outside. But if those first minutes are used to stabilize your internal condition through breath, through stillness, through clarity of direction, then the rest of the day unfolds differently. Not because the world changes, but because your entry point does. The second element is protected creation, a block of time, uninterrupted, where the most important work is done. Not what is urgent, but what is aligned. This is not about doing more tasks. It is about giving your full capacity to what matters most, without fragmentation. The third element is recalibration. At some point in the middle of the day, the accumulated noise begins to shift your state. A brief pause, even a few minutes, can reset that trajectory. Without it, the drift continues unnoticed. The fourth element is how you close. The last moments before sleep are not neutral. They influence how the mind processes the day. Neuroscience has shown that during sleep, the brain consolidates information, strengthens patterns, and reorganizes memory. What you hold in awareness before sleep is not lost. It is carried forward. This is why intention, placed at the end of the day, has weight, because it enters a system that continues to process even when you are no longer conscious of it. Many creators throughout history have understood this intuitively. Moments of insight often appear not during effort, but at the edge of rest, in stillness, in quiet, in the transition between wakefulness and sleep. Something becomes accessible that is not available in constant activity. Time, then, is not just duration. It is structure, it is state, it is design. And when it is used without awareness, it disperses. But when it is shaped intentionally, it becomes something else, an infrastructure. Because what you build is not only determined by what you do, but by the quality of the moments in which you do it. So the shift is not to find more time. It is to stop losing it in states that work against you. Because once time becomes aligned, everything built within it begins to change with it. Chapter 18, The Physics of Forgiveness. You're still paying every single day for something that is no longer happening. If there were one practice capable of releasing the greatest amount of blocked energy in the shortest possible time, it would not be discipline, not effort, not even clarity. It would be forgiveness. Not as morality, not as generosity, but as precision. Resentment is not just a feeling. It is stored charge, an unresolved pattern held in the nervous system. When something harmful happens and is not fully processed, the body does not register it as finished. It records it as an open loop, a threat that has not been resolved, and so it keeps responding. Every time the memory is activated, even subtly, the body reacts. Cortisol rises, adrenaline increases. The system prepares, not because the danger is present, but because the body remembers. And the body does not differentiate between what is happening and what has happened. This creates a continuous state, a low-grade activation that never fully turns off. From a frequency perspective, this matters, because a system that repeatedly signals threat cannot simultaneously signal openness. And what is transmitted outward reflects that internal condition. At the same time, energy is being used constantly. Maintaining that internal response requires attention, biochemical activity, attention, and that energy is no longer available for anything else. So what you're carrying is not just memory, it is cost. This is where forgiveness becomes practical, not symbolic. Research led by Fred Luskin at Stanford University showed that individuals who engaged in forgiveness practices experienced measurable reductions in stress markers, including blood pressure and physical symptoms associated with chronic tension. But the more consistent observation was internal. People described a release, a lightness, as if something that had been held for a long time was no longer there. That something is the charge. Forgiveness does not erase the past, it dissolves the reaction. When the reaction remains, the event continues to exist in the present. When the reaction fades, the event becomes what it actually is, finished. But this process cannot be forced because the body does not respond to declarations. It responds to experience. Saying "I forgive" while still reacting internally does not complete the process. It only masks it. Real forgiveness moves through stages. First, recognition, seeing clearly what happened without distortion, not minimizing it, not amplifying it. Second, understanding, not to justify, but to expand perspective and see the conditions behind the action. Third, expression, allowing the emotional response to move instead of suppressing it. And finally, release, a deliberate decision to stop feeding the loop and withdraw attention from what no longer exists in real time. There are practices that support this. Ho'oponopono, for example, uses 4 simple phrases. "I'm sorry," "Please forgive me," "I love you," "Thank you." Simple, but when practiced with awareness, they engage multiple layers at once and begin to soften the stored reaction. Because forgiveness is not an event, it is a process of disengagement. Each time you choose not to react, the charge weakens, and as the charge weakens, energy returns. That energy becomes available for clarity, for movement, for creation. This is why forgiveness is misunderstood. It is seen as something you give, but in reality, it is something you stop holding. Because as long as the past continues to activate your present, it is still active, and anything active continues to shape what comes next. So the shift is not to forget, it is to stop reliving. Because the moment the reaction ends, the cost ends with it. And what you recover is not just peace, but capacity, the ability to move forward without carrying what no longer belongs to you. Chapter 19, The Intelligence of Intuition. The voice you keep ignoring is the one that's been right more times than your thinking ever was. At some point in the last century, a quiet decision was made. Only what could be measured, analyzed, and logically explained would be considered valid knowledge. Everything else, intuition, instinct, the body's internal signals, was pushed aside as unreliable. That decision shaped how people think. And it came at a cost. Because what is now becoming clear is that intuition is not the opposite of intelligence. It is another form of it. Neuroscience has begun to reveal that decision-making is not purely analytical. In fact, when the emotional and intuitive systems are disrupted, the ability to make even simple decisions collapses. Antonio Damasio studied patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, an area associated with emotional processing. These individuals retained their logic. They could analyze situations, compare options, explain outcomes, but they could not decide. Not effectively, not consistently. Damasio described this through what he called the somatic marker, a system where the body, through sensation, provides immediate feedback based on accumulated experience, allowing decisions to be made quickly and often more accurately than conscious reasoning alone. In other words, your body knows before your mind finishes thinking, and yet most people ignore that signal because they have been trained to trust what they can explain, not what they can feel. But intuition is not vague. It has characteristics. It is immediate. It appears before analysis. It is calm. It does not carry urgency or panic. It is persistent. If ignored, it returns. And it is physical. It shows up as a sensation, a shift in the chest, a tightening or release, a clarity that does not need explanation. In contrast, anxious thinking behaves differently. It argues. It repeats. It tries to convince. It creates noise. This distinction matters, because if you cannot tell the difference, you will follow the wrong signal. Beyond personal experience, there's another layer to consider. Some researchers have explored the possibility that consciousness is not limited to what is stored in memory, that it may have access to information beyond direct experience. Theoretical physicists like Amit Goswami have suggested that awareness may interact with a broader field, while experimental programs, such as those conducted at Princeton's Pear Lab, have explored whether perception can extend beyond the traditional senses. These areas remain debated, but they point towards something consistent. That intuition may not be limited to what you already know. From a practical standpoint, this changes how you approach decisions, because instead of relying only on analysis, you begin to include another source, one that operates faster, quieter, and often with greater precision in complex situations. But this requires training, not in the sense of adding something new, but in removing interference. Intuition is not absent, it is drowned out. The first step is silence, creating moments where the constant stream of thought is reduced enough for subtler signals to appear. The second is attention. Before making decisions, noticing what the body is communicating, not just what the mind is constructing. The third is verification, tracking your own experience, what you felt, what you followed, what happened after. Very few people do this consistently. Those who do begin to see a pattern, not occasional accuracy, but repeated alignment. Over time, confidence shifts, not toward more thinking, but toward clearer listening. Because intuition is not random, it is structured. It draws from layers of information that are not always accessible to conscious reasoning. And when it is recognized, something changes. Decisions become faster, less conflicted, more direct. This does not eliminate analysis, it refines it. Because the most effective decisions are not made by logic alone. They are made when logic and intuition are aligned. So the shift is not to stop thinking. It is to stop ignoring. Because the signal is already there. It has always been there. And the moment you learn to recognize it, you stop searching outside for answers that your system has been giving you all along. Chapter 20. The Law of Deliberate Action. Nothing you're waiting for is coming until you move. This chapter exists to dismantle one of the most seductive and damaging distortions surrounding manifestation. The idea that you can visualize, align your energy, and then wait for reality to rearrange itself without your participation. It sounds appealing, it feels effortless, and it quietly keeps people stuck. Because the universe does not replace action, it works through it. Synchronicity, alignment, and what many call flow do not eliminate movement in the physical world. They transform it. They change the source from which action emerges, and that difference determines everything. There is a clear distinction here. Action driven by pressure and action driven by alignment are not the same, even if they look identical from the outside. Forced action begins in fear. Fear of not having enough, fear of falling behind, fear of failing, fear of being judged. From that state, movement becomes tense. It feels heavy. It requires constant effort to sustain. And even when it produces results, those results often feel unstable or misaligned because they were created from internal conflict. Inspired action emerges differently. It does not feel rushed. It does not need to prove anything. It comes from clarity, from a settled internal state where direction is already known. From there, movement becomes precise. Energy is not scattered. Effort is still present, but it is not forced. And the results reflect that coherence. Jacob von Uexküll introduced the concept of the Umwelt, the idea that each organism lives within its own perceptual world. Two beings can exist in the same environment and experience entirely different realities based on what their systems are tuned to detect. A dog and a bird in the same forest do not perceive the same world. The same principle applies here. A person operating from fear moves through a field that appears full of obstacles. They notice risk. They anticipate problems. Their attention is drawn toward what could go wrong. A person operating from clarity moves through that same environment and sees something else. Openings, timing, connection points, subtle signals that guide action. The environment has not changed. The perception has. And perception determines action. This is why deliberate action matters. Because action is not just what you do. It is how you enter into what you do. There are three elements that define this kind of action. The first is initiation from state. Before acting, even briefly, there is a moment of alignment, a shift out of reactivity into awareness. It does not require long preparation. Sometimes a few minutes is enough. But without that shift, the action that follows carries the noise of whatever state preceded it. The second is excellence without rigidity. The action is done with care, with presence, with attention to detail, not to achieve perfection, but because the quality of the action reflects the quality of the state. Perfectionism often masks anxiety. It slows movement and fragments focus. The third is evaluation without self-judgment. After action, there is observation. What worked, what didn't, what shifted. The outcome is not a reflection of identity. It is information. And that information becomes direction for what comes next. This changes the entire process. Instead of acting randomly and reacting emotionally, you begin to move with feedback. Over time, something stabilizes. The gap between intention and result narrows, not because the world becomes easier, but because your actions become more precise. Manifestation is not passive. It is participatory. You do not wait for conditions. You enter them. And when action is aligned, something else begins to happen. Effort reduces. Timing improves. Connections appear, not as coincidence, but as consequence. Because every action taken from a coherent state interacts differently with the environment than action taken from confusion or fear. So the shift is not to do more, it is to act differently. To move from clarity instead of pressure, from alignment instead of urgency. Because the field does not respond to what you think, it responds to what you sustain. And action is where that state becomes visible, not just to the world, but to the system you are constantly shaping through it. Chapter 21. The silent language of the body. Your body is already telling the truth, and the field is listening to it, not your words. While your words try to shape meaning, and your thoughts attempt to explain what is happening, your body is engaged in a constant, uninterrupted transmission. And in that transmission, there is no distortion, no justification, no performance, only signal. Albert Mehrabian's research on communication revealed something that, although often simplified, remains fundamentally important. In the communication of feelings and attitudes, only about 7% of the impact comes from words, 38% from tone of voice, and 55% from body language. The precise numbers matter less than the principle. The body communicates more powerfully than language. Now extend that beyond conversation, because manifestation is also a form of communication, and your body is speaking all the time. Posture, muscle tension, breathing rhythm, facial expression, the way you occupy space, these are not passive details. They are continuous outputs, repeating hour after hour, forming a stable pattern that the field registers more consistently than any affirmation you repeat. A body in contraction sends a different signal than a body in expansion. When the shoulders drop forward, the chest closes, breathing becomes shallow, and the body reduces its presence in space. The signal reflects withdrawal, protection, low vitality. Across traditions, this has been described as a reduction of life force, whether named chi, prana, or something else. And this is not symbolic. Electromagnetic measurements around the body show observable differences between contracted and expanded states. The body's field changes depending on how it is held. Research building on the work of Amy Cuddy and expanded by Dana Carney demonstrated that posture does not only express state, it influences it. Holding an expansive posture for just 2 minutes produces measurable changes in hormonal activity, increasing factors associated with confidence and reducing those associated with stress. The body is not waiting for the mind to change. It is leading. But the body does not only reflect the present, it carries the past. Somatic psychology, through the work of Wilhelm Reich, Peter Levine, and Bessel van der Kolk, has shown that unprocessed experiences are not simply remembered cognitively. They are stored physically, in patterns of tension, restricted breathing, habitual postures that repeat the original emotional state long after the event has passed. Van der Kolk summarized this directly. The body keeps the score, which means the past is not only something you think about, it is something you are still holding, and what you are holding continues to be transmitted. From the perspective of frequency, this becomes critical, because the field does not respond to intention alone. It responds to consistency, and the body is the most consistent system you have. This is why working with the body is not secondary, it is direct. Releasing tension through movement, through breath, through awareness is not just beneficial for physical health. It changes the baseline pattern being emitted. It clears the accumulated charge that has been shaping your state without your awareness. So the observation begins here. Not in theory, but in experience. What is your body doing right now? Where is tension present that you have stopped noticing? What posture do you fall into when you are not being observed? How does your breathing move when nothing is forcing it to change? These are not minor details. They are the foundation. Because the body is always communicating, and it does so with more consistency than your thoughts. Which means that small, deliberate changes, opening the chest, deepening the breath, allowing the body to occupy space fully, begin to shift the pattern, not once, but repeatedly. And over time, repetition becomes identity. Identity becomes signal. Signal becomes outcome. So the shift is not to say something different. It is to embody something different. Because once the body changes, the message changes with it. And the field responds to what is sustained, not what is spoken. Chapter 22. The sacred geometry of goals. Most of your goals fail, not because you lack effort, but because they were never built to pull reality toward them. Goals are usually treated as simple targets, checkpoints used to measure progress, something administrative, almost mechanical. But at the level where manifestation actually operates, a goal is not a checklist item. It is a structure, an information pattern, a center of gravity that organizes everything around it. In chaos theory, mathematicians like Edward Lorenz described something called an attractor, a state toward which a system naturally evolves, even when starting from completely different conditions. No matter where the system begins, it is drawn toward a specific pattern. That is what a properly constructed goal becomes, an attractor. But not all goals have this power, because not all goals are built with enough structure to organize anything beyond intention. The first element is specificity. A vague goal creates a weak signal. Saying, "I want success" or "I want abundance" provides no coordinates. There is nothing for the system to organize around. But when a goal becomes sensory, when it includes what you will see, hear, feel, experience physically and emotionally, it becomes precise. It gains form. And once it has form, it can begin to pull events into alignment. The second element is identity. A goal framed as something to obtain keeps you separate from it. It remains outside. But a goal framed as identity changes the relationship. Not, "I want to have," but "I am." Because identity engages a deeper layer of the system. It changes behavior, perception, and expectation simultaneously. And when identity shifts, reality reorganizes around it more quickly than it does around desire alone. The third element is direction. Many goals are built from avoidance, from trying to escape something, lack of money, pain, isolation. But when a goal is structured this way, attention remains anchored to what is being avoided. The system continues to track the problem, not the direction. A goal built from expansion operates differently. It moves towards something. It creates, it builds, it contributes. And because attention follows direction, the field begins to organize in that direction as well. The fourth element is hierarchy. A single goal, isolated, has limited force. But when goals are structured in layers, when smaller goals feed into larger ones, and those larger ones connect to a broader purpose, something else happens. They begin to reinforce each other. Progress at one level strengthens confidence at another. Clarity at a higher level gives direction to the lower. And the entire structure starts to generate momentum. Instead of pushing each goal individually, you begin to move within a system that is already moving. This is where goals stop being tasks and become architecture. Because what you are building is not just an outcome. It is a framework that organizes action, perception, and opportunity into a coherent pattern. And once that pattern is stable, it begins to operate on its own. So the shift is not to set more goals. It is to construct them differently, to give them shape, to connect them, to align them with something larger than the immediate result. Because when a goal is built with precision, it does not need to be forced. It begins to pull. And the more clearly it exists within you, the more naturally reality begins to organize around it. Chapter 23. The Alchemy of Failure. The reason failure keeps showing up in your life is because you still haven't learned how to use it. Failure is the one teacher modern culture keeps trying to silence. Everything around you pushes speed, results, visible success, as if anything that doesn't immediately work is a mistake to avoid. And yet, reality doesn't follow that narrative. It continues to deliver failure with the same consistency as success, because both serve the same function. Calibration. Carol Dweck's research at Stanford on fixed versus growth mindsets revealed a pattern that explains why some people remain stuck while others evolve. Those who interpret failure as proof of inadequacy begin to withdraw. They avoid challenges, hesitate in uncertainty, and stop earlier than their capacity would allow. Over time, their world shrinks, not because of ability, but because of interpretation. In contrast, those who read failure as information behave differently. They lean in, they adjust, they continue, and as they continue, their capacity expands beyond what would have been possible within a fixed frame. This difference is not subtle, it compounds, and at the level of frequency, it becomes even more pronounced. A fixed interpretation of failure reinforces limitation. Each setback becomes confirmation, and that confirmation shapes perception, expectation, and action. A growth interpretation transforms the same event into data, and data changes direction. Failure, then, is not the opposite of success. It is the mechanism that refines it. Metallurgy provides a clear image. Gold is not extracted by avoiding heat, it is purified by it. The ore is exposed to intensity, and through that process, what is not essential is removed. What remains is stronger, more stable, more precise. The gold is not damaged, it is revealed. The same principle applies here. What appears as breakdown is often preparation. Consider how this has unfolded in real cases. Thomas Edison went through more than 1,000 unsuccessful attempts before creating a functional light bulb. When asked about those failures, he did not describe them as loss. He described them as discoveries, each one eliminating what did not work and bringing him closer to what would. Steve Jobs was removed from Apple, the company he created, in 1985. At the time, it appeared as collapse. But that period led him into experiences that reshaped his perspective, his leadership, his understanding of product and design. When he returned in 1997, he was not the same founder, and the company he rebuilt reflected that shift. J.K. Rowling faced rejection from 12 publishers before Harry Potter was accepted. Those rejections did not stop the work. They filtered it, refined it, positioned it until it found the point where it could expand. In each of these cases, failure was not interruption. It was alignment. It removed what was not ready. It strengthened what remained. So the question is not how to avoid failure. It is how to read it, because the meaning you assign determines what it becomes. If it is taken as judgment, it contracts you. If it is taken as instruction, it redirects you. And that redirection is where progress actually begins. The most effective shift is simple. Instead of asking what failure says about you, ask what it reveals about the system you are operating in. What is it showing about the approach? What is it indicating about timing? What is it revealing about alignment? This question changes everything because it removes identity from the equation and replaces it with information. And information can be used. Each adjustment, each refinement builds on the previous one. And over time, those adjustments accumulate. What once looked like repeated failure becomes a sequence, a progression, a narrowing toward precision. Failure does not stop you. Misinterpretation does. Because when you see it clearly, it stops being something to avoid. It becomes something to use. And once you begin to use it, it starts working for you instead of against you. Chapter 24. The Resonance of Prosperity. In a quiet restaurant, two people receive the same bill, and something invisible happens that no one around them can see. One feels a subtle contraction in the chest, a hesitation before reaching for the wallet, a fleeting calculation of what this moment costs. The other moves with ease, almost without thought, not because the number is smaller, but because the experience of it is different. That difference is not in the money, it is in the state. Prosperity begins there, long before it ever appears as a number on a screen or a balance in an account. It begins as a pattern in the body, in the nervous system, in the way attention and emotion respond to the movement of value. And this pattern, once stabilized, determines whether wealth accumulates, circulates, or quietly disappears. What we call prosperity is not random. It has structure. It has signatures that can be observed, measured, and understood. At the biochemical and neurological level, it is distinct from the state of scarcity, and learning to generate that state before external evidence appears is what separates those who sustain wealth from those who experience it only in brief, unstable cycles. Researchers like Daniel Kahneman, Richard Thaler, and Shlomo Benartzi have shown that financial behavior is not governed primarily by rational calculation. It is shaped by emotional conditioning and unconscious beliefs. People act not on what money is, but on what money has meant to them throughout their lives. Someone raised in an environment of instability often carries an internal expectation of loss. Even when income increases, the underlying pattern remains unchanged. Decisions are made defensively, opportunities are approached with hesitation, and moments of gain are often followed by actions that return the system to what feels familiar. The external situation shifts, the internal signal does not, and over time, the outcome aligns with the signal. Neuroscientist Paul Zak adds another dimension to this understanding through his work on oxytocin. This hormone, associated with trust and social bonding, plays a central role in economic exchange. Where trust is present, cooperation expands. Where trust is impaired, especially by early relational experiences, the system becomes cautious, closed, and fragmented. Prosperity in practice depends on networks of trust, and trust is not built through logic alone. It is felt. From this perspective, prosperity is not simply money. It is a field condition shaped by how you relate to value, to exchange, and to flow. And this field can be developed deliberately through 4 foundational pillars. The first is gratitude for what is already moving, not large sums, but small, ordinary transactions that pass unnoticed. When attention is brought to these moments with a sense of respect and acknowledgement, something subtle shifts. The system begins to register stability. It begins to recognize that value is already present and circulating. The second is generosity, but not as obligation, as a chosen act. When giving comes from a place of agency rather than pressure, it changes the internal experience of resources. Instead of contraction, there is movement. Instead of fear, there is participation. And this shift communicates to the system that there is enough to engage with, not something to protect at all costs. The third is awareness. The willingness to examine one's own relationship with money without avoidance, to see inherited beliefs, family patterns, and emotional decisions that continue to operate beneath conscious reasoning. Without this step, every new strategy is filtered through an old structure, and that structure quietly shapes the result. The fourth is consistent action. Not dramatic, not impulsive, but aligned. Making financial decisions from clarity rather than urgency. Moving resources in ways that reflect intention, even when the amounts are small. Because action stabilizes the state, and the state reinforces the action. Over time, these elements begin to organize into a coherent pattern. Gratitude creates stability. Generosity creates flow. Awareness removes distortion. Action builds continuity. And together, they form a field that can sustain expansion without collapsing under its own weight. At that point, prosperity is no longer something pursued. It becomes something recognized. And when it recognizes you as a system that can hold, circulate, and expand value without resistance, it does what all stable patterns do. It stays. Not as a temporary event, but as a condition that continues to grow, quietly, consistently, and without the tension that once made it feel out of reach. Chapter 25. The Identity Code. A man can spend years trying to change his life, adjusting habits, repeating affirmations, learning new strategies. And yet, at some quiet moment when pressure builds or uncertainty appears, he returns to the same decisions, the same patterns, the same outcomes, as if something deeper than effort keeps pulling him back to a place he never consciously chose. That place is identity. Not what you want, not what you believe is possible, but what you have accepted, often without realizing it, as the truth of who you are. And from that center, everything else organizes itself with a consistency that can feel almost mechanical. Identity is not a thought. It is a position. It is the point from which perception, decision, and action emerge. And because of that, it becomes the most stable pattern your system can hold. Change anything else, and the system may adapt temporarily. Change identity, and the entire structure reconfigures. Psychologist James Prochaska described this indirectly in his trans-theoretical model of change, where lasting transformation does not occur at the level of behavior alone, but at the level where behavior becomes a natural expression of something deeper. When a person stops smoking because they see themselves as someone who values their health, the change holds. When they stop because they are afraid, It rarely does, because in one case, behavior follows identity. In the other, it fights against it, and identity almost always wins. From a systems perspective, identity functions like an attractor, a stable point toward which everything returns. You can move away from it temporarily, but unless that point shifts, the system reorganizes itself back into alignment with what it considers normal. This is why people can improve, then regress. Build, then lose. Expand, then contract. Not because they failed, but because the system corrected. So the real work is not in forcing new outcomes, but in redefining the center from which those outcomes arise. And that process cannot be done through statements that the body does not believe. When a declaration feels disconnected from lived experience, the system resists it, not out of weakness, but out of coherence. Identity changes through evidence, through a gradual accumulation of moments that begin to tell a different story, not through intensity, but through consistency. The first phase is declaration, but not in a way that creates internal conflict. It is a clear articulation of who you are choosing to become, expressed in a way the system can begin to recognize. Not exaggerated, not distant, but specific, grounded, and close enough to feel reachable. The second phase is action. Not large, dramatic actions, but small, deliberate ones that align with that identity. Each action becomes a signal. Each signal becomes a piece of evidence. And evidence, repeated over time, begins to reshape the structure of belief. The third phase is recognition. The conscious act of noticing when you have already acted in alignment with the identity you are building. Not waiting for big proof, but acknowledging the small, consistent shifts, the different response, the quieter confidence, the decision that once would not have been made. These moments accumulate, and as they accumulate, something subtle changes. The new identity stops feeling like an effort. It starts to feel familiar. At that point, the system no longer needs to be pushed. It stabilizes. And from that stability, outcomes that once seemed difficult begin to appear with less resistance. Not because the world changed, but because the point from which you meet it is no longer the same. You do not create a new life by chasing different results. You create it by becoming a different reference point. And once that reference point is established, everything that follows begins to align with it. Quietly, consistently, and with a precision that does not need to announce itself to be real. You do not manifest what you want. You manifest what you are. And what you are, once fully stabilized, no longer needs to reach for anything, because what belongs to it begins to arrive on its own. Chapter 26. The Conspiracy of the Universe. A door opens at the exact moment you stop forcing it. A conversation appears just when you no longer expect it. An idea arrives fully formed in a space where nothing seemed to be happening. And from the outside, it all looks like coincidence. But from within the experience, there is a quiet sense that something has been arranging itself long before you noticed. We are used to the word conspiracy, meaning something hidden and harmful, something working against us in secret. But its origin tells a different story. The Latin conspira means to breathe together, to move in quiet coordination, to participate in the same rhythm without needing to see the whole. And when seen from that angle, the idea changes. Because what if the system is not working against you, but with you, constantly, silently, through processes too complex to track consciously? In the study of complex systems, physicists describe a phenomenon called emergence, the appearance of order, intelligence, and structure that cannot be predicted by examining individual parts in isolation. The human brain is a clear example. No single neuron contains thought, yet together they produce awareness. The intelligence does not reside in the parts. It emerges from their interaction. The same principle can be observed in nature. A flock of birds moves in coordinated patterns so intricate they resemble choreography, yet there is no central leader directing the movement. Each bird follows simple local rules, and from those interactions, something far more complex appears. Order without command, structure without control. The universe operates in a similar way, but on a scale that exceeds any single mind's capacity to map. At every moment, countless variables interact: people, timing, decisions, environments, conditions, and from those interactions, specific outcomes take shape. Opportunities form, encounters align, sequences unfold, not randomly, but not in a way that can be fully planned either. The mind tends to assume that if something was not consciously designed, it must be accidental. But emergence suggests something else. It suggests that coherence at the level of the system produces results that no individual component could design on its own. A simple story illustrates this more clearly. In a small village in the Andes, there was a weaver who had lost his sight early in life, yet continued to produce tapestries of remarkable detail and harmony. When asked how he could create such patterns without seeing them, he would answer in a way that seemed almost paradoxical. He said that his hands were not creating anything. They were following something that was already present in the thread itself. He did not impose the pattern. He responded to it. In the same way, your role is not to control every variable that shapes your life. That would be impossible. The system is too vast, too interconnected, too dynamic to be managed at that level. Your role is to provide a signal, a clear intention, a coherent state, and then remain responsive to what begins to emerge. Because once that signal is stable, the system begins to organize around it. This is not about passivity. It is about participation. A person who understands this does not withdraw from action. They shift how they relate to it. They stop trying to force outcomes into a predetermined form and begin to recognize when conditions are aligning in ways they could not have constructed deliberately. They begin to notice patterns, moments that seem slightly out of place, opportunities that appear without warning, conversations that lead somewhere unexpected. From a surface perspective, these are coincidences. From within the system, they are signals. Not instructions in the form of words, but openings in the structure of events, moments where alignment is already forming and action can move with less resistance. The difficulty is that these openings rarely arrive with certainty. They appear quietly, and if ignored, they close just as quietly. The system continues, but the specific configuration that made that moment possible dissolves. So the practice is not to control the entire process, but to become sensitive to it, to trust that not everything needs to be seen in advance, to remain attentive enough to recognize when something is unfolding and to act when it does. Because the coordination is not absent, it is simply operating beyond the level of deliberate control. And when your internal state is coherent enough, when intention, attention, and action begin to align, you stop moving against the system and start moving with it. At that point, what once looked random begins to feel structured, not predictable, but not chaotic either. And within that structure, your role becomes clear, not to design every thread, but to recognize the pattern as it forms and respond in time. Chapter 27. The equation of merit. Imagine something good finally arriving into your life, exactly what you once asked for. And instead of ease, there is a subtle tension, a quiet discomfort, a sense that it might not last, or worse, that it was never truly meant for you in the first place. That reaction is rarely spoken out loud, but it is often there, and it reveals something deeper than desire. It reveals what you believe you deserve. There is a question most people never ask themselves directly, not because it is difficult to understand, but because it is difficult to face. Not the answer you would say to others, not the version you repeat in affirmations, but the one that appears in silence, in the body, in the way you respond when something valuable enters your life. Do you actually feel worthy of receiving it? Because that answer, the one embedded in the nervous system rather than the conscious mind, acts as a regulator. It determines how much of anything, money, love, opportunity, you allow to enter, and more importantly, how much you allow to stay. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and expanded by Mary Ainsworth, provides a clear framework for understanding how this regulator is formed. Early experiences with care, attention, and emotional availability create internal models that shape expectations about the world. A child whose needs are met consistently begins to internalize a simple but powerful pattern. When I reach, something responds. There is a sense of safety in receiving, a baseline assumption that support, connection, and even abundance are natural. But when those early signals are inconsistent, absent, or unpredictable, a different model forms. Not as a conscious belief, but as a pattern in the system. Something closer to, I should not expect too much, I should not rely, I should not take up space. These patterns do not disappear, they evolve, and they extend beyond relationships into every domain of life, including the way a person relates to success, to money, to recognition, to love. What appears externally as self-sabotage is often the system maintaining internal coherence, because every system has a range it considers normal. And when experience exceeds that range, when something too good happens, the system reacts not with expansion, but with correction. That is the glass ceiling of deservingness, not imposed from outside, but regulated from within. This is why someone can reach a certain level of success and then lose it, not once, but repeatedly. Why someone can enter a relationship that is stable and supportive and still create conflict where none is necessary. Why moments of genuine progress are followed by decisions that quietly undo them, not because of lack of ability, but because the system is returning to what it recognizes as familiar. Changing this does not begin with effort alone, because effort operates at the level of behavior, and this pattern operates deeper. It requires introducing new experiences into the system, small but consistent signals that begin to shift what feels acceptable, what feels safe, what feels deserved. One of the simplest ways this appears is in the act of receiving. People who carry a low sense of deservingness rarely receive easily. They deflect compliments. They minimize recognition. They feel the need to give something back immediately, as if balance must be restored before they can fully accept what was offered. These are not random habits. They are expressions of a deeper program, a quiet refusal to let something arrive without condition. And the shift begins there. Not with large changes, but with small, deliberate moments, accepting appreciation without dismissing it, allowing someone to offer support without turning it into a transaction, staying present in a moment of success without anticipating its end. Each of these moments becomes a signal, not dramatic, but precise, a signal that updates the system, that expands the range of what can be held without tension. Over time, these signals accumulate, and as they do, something changes. The threshold rises. The system no longer reacts to expansion as if it were a threat. It begins to stabilize within it. And from that new baseline, what once felt excessive begins to feel normal. Not overwhelming, not undeserved, just natural. And when that happens, the question of whether you can have something becomes less important. Because the system has already answered a more fundamental one, that you can keep it. Chapter 28. The network of synchronized allies. At some point, every meaningful path begins to feel less like a straight line you are forcing forward and more like a series of encounters, conversations, and unexpected alignments that seem to arrive just when they are needed, as if something beyond individual effort is quietly coordinating who appears, when they appear, and what becomes possible through them. From the outside, it looks like connection. From within the process, it feels like timing. And when you look closer, it is neither random nor accidental. No significant achievement in history has been the result of a single individual operating in isolation. Behind every visible outcome is a structure of relationships, mentors, collaborators, and facilitators who entered at specific moments, contributed specific pieces, and together formed something no single person could have produced alone. Network science has studied this directly. Mathematicians like Albert Laszlo Barabasi demonstrated that complex systems, whether biological, technological, or social, organize themselves into patterns where certain nodes become highly connected hubs. These hubs do not simply have more connections by chance. They amplify flow. Information, opportunities, and resources move through them with greater speed and reach. Your position in such a network matters, not as status, but as function. Whether you operate as a connector, a contributor, or remain on the periphery determines the volume and quality of what reaches you over time. What network theory describes mathematically, the language of manifestation describes as resonance. The people you attract, the ones who stay, and the ones who leave are not determined solely by circumstance. They are influenced by the quality of the field you carry into interaction. A person who consistently operates from clarity, generosity, and purpose tends to draw others who recognize and respond to that pattern. Not immediately, not always visibly, but steadily. Over time, these connections begin to form a network where the combined effect exceeds what any individual node could generate alone. This is where the idea of collective intelligence becomes relevant. Research from institutions like the MIT Media Lab has shown that under conditions of trust, open communication, and shared intent, groups can produce solutions and insights that none of their members could reach independently. Intelligence emerges not from the individual, but from the interaction. The same principle applies here. A network is not simply a list of contacts. It is a field, and the quality of that field determines what becomes possible within it. Building such a network does not begin with strategy alone. It begins with how you participate. The first principle is contribution before extraction, not as a tactic, but as a consistent orientation. When attention is placed on what can be offered rather than what can be gained, something shifts in the dynamic. The interaction becomes generative rather than transactional, and over time, this creates a pattern others recognize and trust. The second principle is authenticity, not in the sense of self-expression for its own sake, but in the alignment between what you present and what you are actually building. When there is coherence between those two, connections deepen more quickly. When there is misalignment, even subtle, the network weakens. The third principle is connection between others, introducing people who could benefit from knowing each other. Creating links that extend beyond your direct involvement turns you into a node that increases the value of the entire system, and systems tend to reinforce nodes that enhance their function. The fourth principle is recognition. Not generic acknowledgement, but specific, visible appreciation for the contributions others make. This reinforces the structure of the network. It stabilizes relationships. It encourages continued participation in a way that obligation alone cannot sustain. Over time, these principles shape something that feels different from a collection of contacts. It begins to feel like alignment, where the right person appears at the right moment, not because of chance, but because the network has reached a level of coherence where those connections become more likely. At that point, progress is no longer driven only by personal effort. It is supported, extended, amplified. And the difference between operating alone and operating within such a field is not incremental. It is exponential, because what you are building is no longer limited to what you can do. It is influenced by what the network can do through you. And once that system is active, the path forward becomes less about pushing and more about participating in something that is already moving. Chapter 29, The Discipline of Vision. Have you ever noticed how easy it is to feel completely certain about your future and then completely forget it the next day? Not because something went wrong, not because you changed your mind, but because nothing in your life was built to remember it. A vision can arrive with a strange kind of clarity, almost like a memory of something that hasn't happened yet, something that feels real for a moment, grounded, undeniable, and then, almost quietly, it slips, replaced by routine, by small decisions, by the familiar patterns that require no effort to follow. It doesn't disappear. It gets outcompeted, not by something stronger, but by something more practiced. And this is where most people misunderstand the process. They think the problem is the vision itself, that it needs to be clearer, bigger, more inspiring. But the truth is often simpler and less comfortable. The vision is not the weak part. The system around it is. A vision without discipline behaves like a signal with no receiver. It exists, but it cannot stabilize. And discipline without vision becomes a system that runs without direction, efficient, but empty. But when the two are aligned, something shifts, not in effort, but in persistence. Neuroscience has mapped this with precision. The work of Anne Graybiel on the basal ganglia shows how the brain converts repeated actions into automatic routines through a process called chunking, where individual steps merge into a single pattern that runs almost without conscious effort once it is triggered. That is why something that once felt difficult becomes effortless. And that is also why most intentions fail. Not because they were unrealistic, but because they were never repeated enough to become automatic. Because what is not repeated remains fragile, and what remains fragile cannot survive daily life. This changes how discipline is understood. It is not something you force, it is something you install. The practices that support your vision, reflection, alignment, action are not meant to depend on how you feel. They are meant to become part of your system, something that continues even when your emotional state fluctuates. At that point, something important happens. The question is no longer whether you are motivated. It becomes whether the structure exists. Aristotle described this long before modern science confirmed it. We are what we repeatedly do, not what we intend, not what we say, but what we stabilize through repetition until it becomes natural. From this perspective, discipline is not pressure. It is architecture. And like any architecture, it has foundations. The first is the beginning of the day, a fixed entry point that sets your internal state before anything external reshapes it. Its power lies in its consistency. Over time, it becomes a signal the brain recognizes, a shift into a different mode of being. The second is a personal standard, not defined by outcomes, but by integrity. How you handle your time, how you keep your word, how you show up in moments that no one is watching. These are not results, they are identity in motion. The third is recalibration, a deliberate moment each week to step back, to observe your direction, to adjust before small misalignments turn into something larger. And the fourth is recovery. Because disruption is inevitable, there will be days when the system breaks. What matters is not the break itself, but the return. Without a clear way back, a temporary lapse becomes a pattern. With it, the system restores itself quickly. Together, these elements create something most people never build. Continuity, a way of moving forward that does not depend on mood. Because without continuity, vision fades. And without vision, discipline becomes empty. But when both are present, something else begins to take shape. Not force, not urgency, but momentum. And once momentum builds, the process changes. You are no longer pushing yourself forward. You are being carried by something you have repeated long enough to trust. Until eventually, without a clear moment of transition, the life you once imagined stops feeling like something separate and becomes the natural extension of what you do every day. Chapter 30. The quantum body. A mind can believe everything is aligned, while the body quietly signals the opposite. Not loudly, not dramatically, but through tension that never fully releases, through fatigue that lingers longer than it should, through a subtle background state that feels normal only because it has been there for so long. And this is where something essential is often missed. Because for decades, modern medicine, with all its precision and undeniable success, has approached the body as a machine, something to be repaired part by part, system by system, as if each function could be understood in isolation from the rest. For many conditions, especially those with clear physical causes, this approach has been remarkably effective. But when the question shifts from survival to coherence, from treating disease to understanding how the body participates in shaping experience, that same model begins to show its limits. Because the body does not operate in parts, it operates in conversation. Over the past 40 years, fields like psychoneuroimmunology have made this increasingly clear. What older traditions, such as traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurveda, observed through experience, is now being mapped through research. The nervous system, the immune system, and psychological states are not separate layers. They are continuously informing one another, every moment. Researcher Candace Pert contributed a key insight here, identifying what she called the molecules of emotion, neuropeptides that carry emotional information throughout the body. These molecules do not stay confined to the brain. Their receptors are distributed across tissues, organs, and systems, meaning that emotion is not something you only feel in your head. It is something your entire body participates in. The gut, often described as a second brain, contains a network of neurons comparable in scale to the spinal cord. The heart has its own intrinsic nervous system, capable of processing information independently. Signals move constantly, not in one direction, but across a network, which leads to a different understanding. The body does not simply follow the mind, it contributes to it. It remembers, it responds, it influences. And all of this becomes part of what you project into the world, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived state. From this perspective, trying to shift your life only by changing thoughts becomes incomplete. Thought matters, but it is only one layer of a much larger system. The body has its own patterns, its own rhythms, its own stored responses, and unless those are included, the system remains divided. This is where the idea of the quantum body becomes practical rather than conceptual. Not as something mystical, but as recognition. The way you eat, the quality of your sleep, the amount and kind of movement in your day, the level of stimulation you expose yourself to, these are not secondary details. They are inputs that shape the internal environment in which everything else operates. A body consistently under stress, whether through poor nutrition, lack of rest, constant digital input, or prolonged inactivity, begins to stabilize in a state of contraction. Hormones like cortisol and adrenaline remain elevated, and that state becomes familiar. Not optimal, familiar. And from that state, even the most intentional thinking has to work against a current that is already set. In contrast, when the body is treated with attention, when it is nourished, moved, rested, and allowed to recover, something shifts. Not instantly, but steadily. The baseline changes. The system becomes more open, more responsive, less reactive. And from that foundation, everything else becomes easier to align. This is not about perfection. It is not about achieving an ideal image defined by culture. The quantum body is not a visual standard. It is a functional one. It is the body understood as an instrument, one that produces a certain quality of experience depending on how it is treated. Just as an instrument that is tuned and maintained produces a different sound than one that is neglected, the body reflects the care it receives. And that reflection is not separate from how you think, how you feel, or how you act. It is part of the same system. So the question becomes less about controlling outcomes and more about preparing the instrument through which those outcomes are shaped. Because the sound, whatever form it takes, is never independent of the instrument that produces it. Take care of it with that understanding, not as a task, but as alignment. And over time, without forcing it, something begins to change, not only in how the body feels, but in what it makes possible. Chapter 31. The Dance with Uncertainty. The moment you feel uncertain, your mind starts inventing problems that don't even exist yet. It doesn't wait for reality to unfold. It rushes ahead, filling the unknown with imagined outcomes, tightening the body, speeding up the breath, turning an open space into something that feels like pressure, as if not knowing were already a sign that something is wrong. And the strange part is, this reaction feels completely natural, almost automatic, because it is. The human nervous system was not designed for modern life filled with abstract uncertainty. It was shaped in environments where not knowing often meant immediate risk, where hesitation could be costly, where ambiguity needed to be resolved quickly. And so, over time, the brain learned to treat the unknown as something to eliminate, not explore, not tolerate, but eliminate. Neuroscience reflects this clearly. The same physiological systems that activate in response to physical danger, the sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight response, are triggered by uncertainty itself. Not because the situation is dangerous, but because the brain interprets the lack of certainty as a potential threat. And this is where the contradiction begins. Because the process of manifestation does not exist inside certainty, it exists inside the unknown. If everything were already guaranteed, already defined, there would be nothing to unfold, nothing to emerge. The entire process depends on that space where outcomes are not yet fixed, where possibilities are still fluid. Physicist David Bohm described reality as a continuous unfolding, not a static structure, but a movement from potential into form. In that movement, uncertainty is not an error in the system. It is the condition that makes creation possible. Without it, nothing new could appear. This idea is echoed in complexity science. Research from the Santa Fe Institute shows that systems capable of producing innovation operate at what is called the edge of chaos, a state between complete order and complete disorder. Too much order, and everything becomes predictable, but stagnant. Too much chaos, and nothing holds long enough to build upon. But in that narrow space between the two, something different happens. Patterns form, structures emerge, possibilities expand. And for a human being, this has a direct implication. The ability to remain in uncertainty without collapsing into fear becomes a defining skill. Psychology calls this tolerance for ambiguity. And like any skill, it can be developed, not by forcing confidence, but by gradually allowing yourself to remain present in situations where the outcome is not fully known, starting with small uncertainties, where the stakes are low, and expanding from there until the nervous system begins to learn something new. That uncertainty is not the same as danger. That not knowing does not require immediate resolution. That space can exist without panic. This is where the metaphor shifts, because moving through uncertainty can take two very different forms. One is reactive, like someone thrown into unfamiliar territory, trying to control everything at once, exhausting energy, making rushed decisions, turning uncertainty into stress. The other is adaptive, like someone navigating a new landscape, observing, adjusting, moving step by step, allowing information to reveal itself over time. The environment is the same. The experience is completely different, and that difference changes what becomes possible. Because most of the defining moments in your life did not come from what you could predict. They came from what you couldn't fully see at the time, from encounters you didn't plan, from opportunities that appeared without warning. From the perspective of control, that feels unstable. From the perspective of creation, that is where everything happens. Uncertainty is not blocking your path. It is the space where your path is still forming. And when the body no longer reacts to it as a threat, something opens. Attention sharpens. Decisions become clearer. Energy is no longer wasted resisting what cannot be defined. Instead, it is directed toward moving with what is unfolding. And over time, that changes everything. Because uncertainty stops feeling like something you need to escape and starts feeling like something you can move within. Like a rhythm you don't fully control, but can learn to follow. Chapter 32. The Advanced Mirror Principle. In Chapter 2, we touched a surface most people recognize but rarely follow all the way through. The idea that your external reality reflects your inner frequency. At that level, it feels almost acceptable, even useful. But taken further, taken to its most precise and uncomfortable expression, the principle becomes something else entirely. Because it stops pointing at circumstances and starts pointing at people. More specifically, the people who provoke you. The ones who irritate you beyond reason, who trigger reactions that feel immediate and disproportionate, as if something in you has already decided before your mind has had time to explain it. These reactions are not random, and they are not only about what is happening in front of you. They are reflections, not of what you openly recognize, but of what you have not yet integrated. Carl Jung described this mechanism with a clarity that remains difficult to ignore. He called it shadow projection. The shadow is not simply a collection of negative traits, but everything the individual has pushed out of conscious identity because it did not fit the image they chose to maintain. Traits judged unacceptable, impulses considered dangerous, versions of the self that were denied not because they did not exist, but because they were inconvenient. But what is denied does not disappear. It reorganizes, and it returns through perception. Jung's formulation was direct. The intensity of your emotional reaction to a characteristic in another person is proportional to the intensity with which that same characteristic has been repressed within you. Not necessarily in the same expression, but in potential, or in history, or in something unresolved. This is why certain traits provoke reactions that feel excessive, arrogance that becomes intolerable, irresponsibility that feels almost offensive, weakness that generates impatience. The reaction is not only about what is seen, it is about what has been pushed away. And the energy required to maintain that separation is not passive, it is continuous. In terms of frequency, this creates distortion. Because denying part of yourself requires sustained effort, and that effort fragments the coherence of your field. The more something is rejected internally, the more energy is required to keep it out of awareness, and the more unstable the overall signal becomes. What appears externally as judgment is often internally a form of maintenance. Shadow work, then, is not about self-criticism. It is about integration. It is the process of recognizing that what you react to outside has a correspondence inside, not as a flaw, but as an element that has been separated from the whole. And when that recognition happens, something shifts. The reaction loses intensity, not because the external situation changes, but because the internal resistance decreases. Energy that was previously used to suppress becomes available. Clarity increases. The field stabilizes. This is why shadow integration produces a level of coherence that no superficial technique can replicate. It does not come from reinforcing only what is acceptable, but from including what was previously excluded. From completeness. The practice itself follows a simple structure. Take the people or situations that currently provoke the strongest emotional response in you. Not mild discomfort, but clear irritation, frustration, or judgment. And instead of analyzing them, instead of focusing on what they are doing, turn the direction inward, not toward your everyday behavior, but toward what you've rejected. Ask quietly and honestly, what is this reflecting in me? Not in its most extreme form, but as possibility, as history, as something unfinished. The answer will not always be immediate, and it will not always be comfortable, but it will be precise, and in that precision, something becomes available. A release. Because what is integrated no longer needs to be defended against, and what no longer needs to be defended against no longer distorts your field. At that point, the mirror changes function. It no longer provokes. It informs, and the people who once felt like obstacles begin to reveal themselves as something else entirely. Not as enemies, but as instruments, calibrating you, showing you with uncomfortable accuracy where your own system is still divided. And once that division is resolved, the reflection loses its charge. Not because the world changed, but because you did. Chapter 33, the multiplication of energy. You don't run out of time, you run out of energy, and then everything you thought you were capable of quietly shrinks to fit what you can sustain. It shows up in familiar ways. A task that should take 1 hour stretches into 3. A clear intention fades into distraction. A decision that once felt obvious becomes heavy, delayed, postponed. And it is tempting to blame time, or discipline, or circumstance. But underneath all of it, something simpler is happening. The system is depleted. From a physical perspective, this follows a principle that governs everything. The universe tends toward entropy, toward disorder, unless energy is introduced and organized. Left alone, structures break down, patterns dissolve, systems lose coherence. Life resists that tendency. Living systems take in energy, process it, and transform it into structure, into complexity, into order. And among all known systems, the human being has a unique advantage: the ability to manage that process deliberately, to not only receive energy, but to multiply it. This reframes something essential. Personal energy is not a fixed resource that drains with use. It is a dynamic system, something that can be restored, amplified, redirected, or mismanaged. Research by Jim Lohr and Tony Schwartz, working with elite athletes, executives, and military personnel, demonstrated that sustained high performance is not primarily limited by time, but by energy. Time remains constant, energy fluctuates, and more importantly, it can be trained. They described 4 interconnected dimensions: physical, emotional, mental, and what they referred to as spiritual, meaning purpose and direction. When one of these weakens, the others follow. When they are aligned, performance increases in ways that are not linear, not additive, but multiplicative. This is where manifestation becomes practical, because everything you are trying to create depends on the quality of energy you bring into it. And that energy is shaped in 4 key ways. The first is recovery. In a culture that equates constant activity with progress, recovery is often misunderstood as inactivity. But in biological systems, growth does not happen during effort. It happens during restoration. Muscles strengthen between training sessions, not during them. The same applies here. Without deliberate periods of recovery, the system does not build capacity. It degrades. The second is eliminating energy leaks. These are often subtle, conversations that leave you drained without clarity, tasks repeated out of habit rather than intention, thought loops that replay without resolution. Each one consumes energy without returning value. And over time, these small leaks accumulate until the system operates below its potential. The third is alignment. When physical energy, emotional state, mental focus, and purpose move in different directions, effort increases and results decrease. But when they are aligned around the same intention, something shifts. The effect is no longer linear, it multiplies. A person acting with clarity, emotional stability, physical vitality, and purpose produces outcomes that cannot be explained by effort alone, because the system is coherent, and coherence amplifies. The fourth is meaning. This is often overlooked, but it is decisive. Activities disconnected from purpose drain energy, even when they are not physically demanding. Activities aligned with something meaningful can generate energy even as they require effort. This is why certain kinds of work feel exhausting after a short time, while others, even more demanding, create a sense of momentum. The difference is not in the activity, it is in the connection to purpose. Meaning does not just guide direction, it fuels the system. When these 4 dimensions are understood and managed deliberately, something becomes possible that most people never experience. Not more time, but more capacity. The same hours begin to produce different results. The same effort begins to carry further because the system itself is operating differently. Energy is no longer being spent randomly. It is being directed, sustained, multiplied. And once that multiplication begins, the process of manifestation changes. Not because the external world shifts immediately, but because the force you bring into it is no longer limited by depletion. It is supported by a system that knows how to renew itself. Chapter 34. The language of dreams and symbols. Every night for hours, your mind keeps working without you. Not in words, not in logic, but in images, fragments, scenes that feel strange, sometimes incoherent, sometimes vivid enough to stay with you long after you wake up. And most of the time, they are dismissed, forgotten, treated as noise. Yet this is the language of the system that runs most of your life. Not a small part of it, but roughly 95% of the processes that shape your behavior, your reactions, your patterns of manifestation operate below conscious awareness. Ignoring that level is not neutral. It is like trying to change outcomes without ever accessing the layer where decisions are actually formed. Carl Jung approached this with unusual seriousness. For him, dreams were not random byproducts of the day, but structured messages, symbolic representations of processes unfolding beneath conscious identity. Archetypes, recurring images, universal patterns were not decorative elements. They were the vocabulary, a way the unconscious communicates what the analytical mind cannot easily process. Modern neuroscience did not dismiss this. It reframed it. Research by Matthew Walker at the University of California, Berkeley, shows that during REM sleep, the brain engages in complex operations, consolidating memory, regulating emotion, and solving problems in ways that are not accessible during waking cognition. Dreams are not interruptions. They are interfaces, moments where deeper processing becomes partially visible. From a practical perspective, this opens two directions. The first is diagnostic. Patterns in dreams are not arbitrary. Recurring themes, repeated emotions, familiar situations carry information. Not always literal, but consistent. A recurring sense of being chased, for example, often corresponds to an underlying perception of pressure or avoidance that may not be obvious during the day. A recurring experience of flying, on the other hand, may reflect an impulse toward expansion, toward freedom, something the conscious mind has labeled impractical or unrealistic. The form varies, the signal remains. And when observed over time, these patterns begin to reveal what is active beneath the surface, what is influencing decisions, reactions, and outcomes without direct awareness. The second direction is more deliberate. It involves the moments just before sleep. There is a transitional phase, the hypnagogic state, where the mind is no longer fully engaged with external reality, but not yet fully asleep. In this state, the filtering function of the conscious mind weakens. Resistance decreases, access increases, and what is introduced there tends to be processed more deeply. The method itself is simple. Before sleep, when the mind has slowed but remains aware, bring a single question, a problem, or an intention into focus. Not as a vague thought, but with clarity and genuine interest. Then release it. No forcing, no repetition, just a clear signal. What happens next is not always immediate, but often something shifts. The answer may appear in a dream, not always in direct form, but through symbols, through situations that reflect the structure of the problem. Or it may appear the next morning as a thought that feels already formed, without the usual effort of reasoning. Or later, unexpectedly, during the day, as if it had been prepared in the background. This is where the metaphor becomes precise. The unconscious is not silent. It is constantly communicating, but not in the language of explanation. In the language of images, of symbols, of patterns. And learning to recognize that language does not require interpretation in a rigid sense. It requires attention, patience, and a willingness to observe without immediately reducing everything to logic. Because not everything meaningful arrives in a form the intellect can immediately explain. Some things arrive indirectly, and when you begin to notice them, something changes. Decisions become less forced. Insights appear without strain. And the sense that everything must be figured out consciously begins to loosen. The mind continues to work, even when you are not watching it. And when you learn to listen to how it speaks, you begin to access a layer of intelligence that was always there, just not in a language you were used to hearing. Chapter 35. the maturity of the manifestor. There is a quiet moment on this path that almost no one prepares you for. The moment when getting what you want stops being enough. Not because desire disappears, not because ambition weakens, but because something deeper begins to feel incomplete, as if the entire process you've been practicing, aligning your thoughts, refining your frequency, applying everything from the earlier chapters, was never meant to end at the level of personal gain. At first, this realization is subtle. It doesn't arrive as a conclusion. It feels more like a shift in weight, as if the center of gravity of your intention begins to move, no longer anchored only in what you want to receive, but slowly expanding towards something that includes others, something that feels larger than the boundaries of your own life. This is the stage most popular teachings avoid, not because it lacks importance, but because it cannot be packaged into quick promises. It asks for patience, for perspective, for a relationship with time and purpose that does not produce immediate gratification. And yet, this is where manifestation stabilizes. This is where it stops being episodic and becomes sustained. Earlier, we explored how frequency shapes outcomes, how identity determines what you can hold, how purpose amplifies the field. All of those principles converge here, not as separate tools, but as a single structure that begins to reorganize how you relate to the process itself. Because at this stage, the relationship changes. You are no longer only asking the field to respond to your desires. You begin to participate in what the field is already unfolding. Philosopher Ervin Laszlo described reality as an interconnected informational field where every act of consciousness leaves a trace, contributing not only to individual experience, but to the evolution of the whole. In that sense, what you become is not isolated. It is cumulative. Your coherence affects more than your own results. It alters the environment in which others operate. And once that is understood, even partially, the logic of manifestation expands. Because what you are building is no longer contained within your own outcomes. It becomes part of a larger pattern. This is why the mature manifestor begins to differ in ways that are not immediately visible, but are structurally decisive. The first difference appears in how time is perceived. Where the beginner looks for confirmation within weeks or months, measuring progress through immediate results, the more developed perspective resembles something closer to cultivation, like planting a tree that will outlive the moment of planting itself. Understanding that growth unfolds across multiple layers, some visible, many not. This does not reduce action. It refines it. The second difference appears in how difficulty is interpreted. Where earlier stages may treat obstacles as signals of misalignment or failure, this stage recognizes them as part of the shaping process itself, as information that adjusts the structure, strengthens capacity, and prepares the system to hold what is being built. The third difference appears in the relationship with outcomes. Instead of attaching value only to whether reality matches the original image, attention expands to include the transformation that occurred along the way, the clarity gained, the refinement of perception, the strengthening of identity that remains regardless of specific variations in result. And then there is the most difficult shift, the one that cannot be simulated. The gradual softening of the ego's need to control every detail. Not the disappearance of intention, but its integration into something wider, where direction remains clear, yet the insistence on how and when begins to loosen. The question changes from, how do I make this happen exactly as I imagine it, to something more open, more aligned with the nature of the field itself. What is trying to emerge through me? This is not passivity. It is participation at a different level. Because the field, as we have seen across previous chapters, operates through patterns, connections, and pathways that the conscious mind cannot fully map. When intention aligns with that larger movement, effort becomes less about forcing outcomes and more about responding to opportunities as they appear, like adjusting sails rather than controlling the wind. And when that alignment stabilizes, something else becomes evident. The scale of what returns begins to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but consistently. Because what you are creating is no longer limited to personal benefit. It touches others. It contributes. It extends. And the field responds differently to that kind of signal. Not out of reward, but out of resonance. A small intention produces a proportional response. A larger, more inclusive intention interacts with a broader network of variables, creating outcomes that extend beyond what the original desire could have contained. At that point, manifestation is no longer something you practice occasionally. It becomes the way you participate in reality, not as someone extracting results, but as someone contributing to the pattern from which results naturally arise. And in that shift, quiet but irreversible, something settles. Not urgency, not striving, but a kind of steady movement where what you build begins to carry its own momentum. And what once felt like something you were trying to achieve starts to feel like something that was already unfolding, waiting for you to grow into it. Chapter 36. The Point of No Return. Strange, isn't it, how one quiet shift can erase an entire past version of you, without noise, without announcement, without anything in the external world changing enough for others to notice. It doesn't arrive like a breakthrough. It doesn't feel like a climax. It feels almost ordinary, like moving through a familiar moment and realizing, without effort, that you are no longer reacting the way you used to. That something which once defined you has simply stopped being available. And that is when it becomes undeniable. Not because you decided it, but because you can't undo it. Earlier, across the previous chapters, identity was not presented as something you declare, but something you build through repetition, through accumulated evidence, through consistent alignment between what you think, what you feel, and what you do. At first, that process feels deliberate, even fragile, as if it could collapse at any moment if attention slips. But beneath that surface effort, something else is happening. A structure is forming. Each aligned action adds weight. Each moment of awareness reinforces a pattern. Each time you choose differently, even in small ways, you leave a trace in the system. And these traces accumulate quietly, without visible transformation, until they reach a threshold where the system reorganizes itself. Physics describes this moment with precision through phase transitions. A system absorbs energy gradually, often without visible change, until it reaches a critical point where the transformation is no longer incremental, but immediate. Water at 100 degrees does not negotiate its way into vapor. It becomes vapor. And once it has changed state, returning to its previous form is no longer natural. It would require reversing the entire set of conditions that made the transformation possible. Personal transformation follows the same logic. For a long time, it feels like effort layered over habit. You correct your reactions, you hold your attention, you choose differently even when it feels uncomfortable. But every one of those moments contributes to a deeper reorganization. Until one day, the old response is no longer there to choose. Not suppressed, not controlled, just absent. This is the point of no return, and you recognize it not through intensity, but through contrast. Situations that once created anxiety now invite curiosity. Uncertainty, which once felt threatening, becomes space. Criticism, which once destabilized you, becomes information you can observe without losing balance. Even silence changes its nature. What once felt heavy, something to escape, becomes the place where your thinking is clearest, where your perception is least distorted. These are not improvements. They are indicators, signs that the system itself has changed. Because identity, as we have established, is not what you say about yourself. It is what your system defaults to when you are not trying. And when that default shifts, everything reorganizes around it. At that point, manifestation ceases to be something you practice. It becomes something you are. You no longer attempt to align. You begin from alignment. Gratitude is no longer something you remember to apply. It arises naturally from how you perceive what is already present. Intention is no longer something you construct. It is embedded in the way you move through decisions, in the way you respond without hesitation. The metaphor of iron becoming steel expresses this transformation with unusual clarity. Iron, subjected to repeated heat and pressure, does not simply become stronger within the same structure. Its internal composition changes. What emerges is not improved iron. It is a different material, and once that change occurs, returning to the original state is not a matter of will. It is a matter of structure. The same is true here. What has changed in you is not temporary, it is foundational. And because of that, going back does not feel like an option. It feels like contradiction. Like trying to occupy a space that no longer fits the shape of your awareness. This is why the point of no return is not dramatic. It is irreversible in the quietest way possible. Not because something external prevents you from going back, but because internally, there is nothing left that wants to. And from that point forward, something stabilizes. Not effort, not intensity, but continuity. A way of moving where action no longer depends on motivation, where alignment no longer depends on reminder, where what you do begins to follow naturally from who you have already become. And that is why this moment is not the end of the path. It is the first moment the path becomes yours. Chapter 37. The Complete Symphony. This was never a book about getting what you want. It was about becoming someone who cannot be denied. At the beginning, it may not have felt that way. It may have felt like a search for answers, for methods, for something you could apply to change outcomes, to bring certain things into your life, to understand why some people seem to attract effortlessly while others struggle despite effort. And step by step, chapter by chapter, the perspective widened. What first appeared as techniques began to reveal themselves as parts of a system. What felt like isolated ideas began to connect. Frequency was not separate from identity. Language was not separate from thought. The body was not separate from intention. And slowly, something became clear. This is not a method you apply occasionally. It is a structure you live within. Physics approaches it through the relationship between observer and observed. Neuroscience approaches it through patterns, conditioning, and perception. Ancient traditions approached it through direct experience, through attention, through presence. Different entry points, same conclusion. That consciousness is not passive, it participates. But understanding that has never been enough. As we've seen, understanding without embodiment changes very little. People understand what would improve their lives every day, how to think, how to act, how to care for their energy, and yet nothing shifts, because knowledge that stays at the level of thought does not reorganize the system. Only lived repetition does. Only what is practiced becomes stable. And once stable, it becomes identity. This is where everything you have encountered begins to function as a whole. Not in sequence, but in integration. The principles explored across this journey, the awareness of what you emit, the ability to inhabit a desired state before it appears externally, the precision of language, the clarity of intention, the release of control over the path, the transformation of pain, the cultivation of certainty, the creation of space, the use of gratitude, the restructuring of identity, the intelligence of the body, the expansion into purpose. These are not steps to complete. They are movements, and together they form a single structure, like instruments in an orchestra that do not wait for each other to finish, but play simultaneously, each contributing to something that only exists when they are combined. You are not following the music. You are conducting it. And this is where the story shifts again. Because the purpose of all of this was never to make reality obey you. It was to bring you into alignment with how it already operates. The Zen story expresses this in a way that avoids abstraction. A student arrives full of theories, concepts, explanations, ready to learn more. The master pours tea into his cup and continues pouring until it overflows. The student reacts. The cup is full. It cannot receive. And that is the lesson. Not that knowledge is useless, but that without space, nothing new can enter. Throughout this process, much of what has happened has not been accumulation. It has been clearing, removing distortions, letting go of patterns that no longer serve, creating enough internal space for something more coherent to stabilize. And now, at this point, the responsibility is no longer external. There is no additional explanation that will change what needs to happen next. Because what matters now is not what you know. It is how you live. There is one final truth that must remain clear, because without it, everything else can be misunderstood. This does not remove difficulty. It does not eliminate loss. It does not guarantee a life without uncertainty. What it changes is not the events themselves, but the way they are processed. Pain no longer closes you. It informs you. Obstacles no longer stop you. They refine you. Loss no longer only takes. It creates space. And when that shift stabilizes, reality begins to feel different. Not easier, but more responsive, because you are no longer interacting with it from fragmentation, but from coherence. You are not separate from what you experience. You are participating in it. Every thought you stabilize, every emotion you embody, every action that emerges from alignment contributes to the structure you live within. This is not occasional, it is continuous. And once you see it clearly, there is no way to unsee it. So what remains is not a final instruction, but a transition. You are no longer someone searching for the right method. You are someone who has begun to understand the system, and that understanding carries a different kind of responsibility. Not pressure, but awareness. Because from here, what unfolds is no longer something you wait for. It is something you participate in. The symphony does not end here. It expands, it evolves, it opens into new movements that cannot be predicted from where you stand now. And the next movement is already waiting for you to step into it. Chapter 38. The Geometry of Silence. There is a kind of intelligence that only appears when you stop trying to think your way forward. A quiet layer beneath effort, where answers do not arrive through reasoning, but through a clarity that seems to surface on its own, as if it had been waiting for the moment you finally stepped out of the way. At first, this feels counterintuitive, even uncomfortable, because everything in modern life trains you in the opposite direction. Movement is rewarded, speed is praised, constant engagement is mistaken for progress, and silence is often interpreted as absence, as a gap that must be filled before it becomes wasted time. But if you look closely at everything we have explored so far, from the role of identity, to the nature of attention, to the way intuition operates beneath conscious thought, a pattern begins to emerge with increasing consistency. What transforms you most does not happen at the surface. Silence belongs to that deeper layer, not as emptiness, but as access. Physics offers a useful entry point into this idea. What we call empty space, the quantum vacuum, is not truly empty. Even at its lowest energy state, it contains fluctuations, subtle movements of energy that arise and dissolve continuously, beyond direct observation, but measurable through their effects. In other words, what appears still is filled with potential activity, and the same structure can be observed within the human system. When the surface layer of thinking quiets, when the constant internal dialogue pauses, the immediate impression is often uncertainty, because the familiar structure of control is no longer present. But if that state is not interrupted, if it is allowed to remain just a little longer, something begins to shift. Not outwardly, inwardly. Neuroscience began to describe this with the discovery of the default mode network. When the brain is not engaged in a specific external task, it does not become inactive. Instead, it activates a different configuration, one that consumes nearly the same amount of energy, but redirects it toward integration, memory processing, and associative thinking. This network is strongly linked to imagination, long-term reflection, and the kind of insight that does not arise through deliberate analysis. Which means that what we often call doing nothing is in fact one of the most active forms of internal processing available. And yet in everyday life, this state is rarely sustained. Not because it is inaccessible, but because it feels unfamiliar. Silence removes the structure of constant input, and without that structure, the mind initially resists. It reaches for distraction, for stimulation, for anything that restores the sense of activity it has learned to associate with control. But if you recall what we explored in earlier chapters, especially in relation to intuition and the body, the most accurate signals rarely come from force. They come from space. Contemplative traditions recognized this long before modern science described it. Whether through Zen meditation, the inward stillness of monastic practice, or the disciplined quiet of yogic systems, the intention was never to escape life, but to access a layer of experience that is not constructed through habit. A layer that is already present. And from that layer, something different becomes available. Clarity that does not argue with itself. Direction that does not depend on urgency. A form of knowing that does not need to justify its presence. There is also an important distinction to make here. Meditation reduces noise. Active contemplation uses the silence that follows. Instead of emptying the mind completely, it introduces a single question, an image, or a direction, and then allows it to settle without interference. What emerges is rarely immediate, but when it does appear, it carries a different quality. More cohesive, less fragmented, as if it did not need to be assembled, but only recognized. This pattern appears repeatedly across different domains. Nikola Tesla described seeing his inventions fully formed during moments of stillness before translating them into physical reality. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart spoke of hearing entire compositions internally before writing them down. Rainer Maria Rilke described poetry arriving during long silent walks, not constructed piece by piece, but received as something already complete. Different contexts, same mechanism. They created enough silence to perceive what constant activity prevents. And this is where silence becomes practical. Not abstract, not distant, but something that can be deliberately shaped. It begins with small, protected intervals, 10 to 20 minutes without input, without distraction, without a defined task. At first, it feels uneventful. Then it feels slightly uncomfortable. But if it is maintained, it begins to feel necessary, not as a pause, but as a recalibration. Over time, this state becomes less dependent on the environment. It begins to appear even within activity, moments where the mind is engaged, but not crowded, where attention is focused, but not fragmented. Athletes recognize this as the zone. Certain traditions describe it as stillness in motion. The label matters less than the shift, because within that shift, something becomes clear. The answers you have been trying to construct through effort often emerge when effort loosens its grip, and that realization changes the relationship with progress itself. You begin to see that not everything improves through addition, through more information, more control, more intensity. Some things require subtraction, the removal of noise, the creation of space. The geometry of silence is not rigid. It does not follow fixed lines or predictable structures. It takes the shape of the space you create within your own attention, and that space, even when small, begins to reorganize how everything else functions. Not by forcing change, but by revealing what was already forming beneath the surface. Because when the noise recedes, even slightly, what has always been present becomes easier to perceive. And once perceived clearly, even once, it is difficult to ignore again. Chapter 39. The Transmission of Lineage. Some patterns in your life feel older than you, not because you've repeated them long enough, but because they were already in motion before you arrived. They show up quietly, in the way you respond under pressure, in how you relate to money, to love, to uncertainty, in reactions that feel automatic, familiar in a way that is difficult to explain, as if you are remembering something rather than learning it. And for a long time, it is easy to assume these patterns are personal, until you begin to look more closely. Because across everything we've explored so far, identity, emotion, frequency, the body as an instrument, there has been an implicit assumption that the starting point is you. But what this chapter begins to reveal is that the starting point is rarely individual. It is inherited, not only culturally or psychologically, but biologically. Epigenetics has brought this into measurable focus. Research by scientists such as Michael Meany at the Douglas Institute and Randy Girdle at Duke University demonstrated that experience, especially sustained emotional states, can leave molecular marks on gene expression without altering the DNA sequence itself. These marks influence how genes are activated or suppressed, and remarkably, they can be passed across generations. In controlled studies, offspring of animals exposed to chronic stress during critical developmental periods exhibited heightened stress responses, even when raised in stable environments. That increased sensitivity did not stop with one generation. It continued, not because the environment repeated, but because the pattern had been encoded. At the same time, the reverse was also observed. Offspring raised in conditions of consistent care, stability, and attuned interaction developed more regulated nervous systems, greater resilience, and a higher capacity for exploration. These traits, too, were transmitted forward, which means something becomes difficult to ignore. What your ancestors experienced did not end with them, and what you stabilize within yourself will not end with you. This reframes the entire idea of personal transformation. It is no longer only about improvement. It becomes interruption and transmission. Earlier, when we explored invisible blockers, we touched on the idea that certain limitations are not consciously chosen, but carried. Bert Hellinger's work with family constellations brought attention to this in a different way, showing how individuals often unconsciously repeat patterns of previous generations, not out of weakness, but out of loyalty. A kind of inherited alignment. The grandson who recreates the financial collapse of a grandfather he never met. the daughter who finds herself in relational dynamics that echo what her mother endured, the son who lives with a quiet sense of limitation tied to a story that was never fully spoken. These are not coincidences in the usual sense. They are continuations, what Hellinger called systemic entanglements, patterns that persist because they have not been fully resolved, and therefore seek expression again, not as punishment, but as completion. And this is where the direction changes. Because if patterns can be transmitted unconsciously, they can also be transformed consciously, not by rejecting what came before, but by recognizing it. There is a difference between carrying a pattern and seeing it. Once seen, something shifts. You are no longer inside it in the same way. You can relate to it. And that space, however small at first, is where change begins. This is why the work of awareness, which appeared in different forms throughout previous chapters, becomes more significant here. Awareness is not only personal clarity, it is interruption of automatic transmission. When you recognize a pattern of scarcity, of fear, of emotional contraction that has repeated across generations, and you begin to respond differently, even in small ways, you are not only changing your own experience, you are altering the direction of that pattern. You are becoming a point where it no longer continues in the same form, and that has consequences beyond what you can measure immediately, because what stabilizes in you becomes part of what is passed forward. Not only to children, but to anyone influenced by your presence, your behavior, your way of relating to the world. In that sense, transformation becomes less about self-improvement and more about continuity. What do you continue? And what do you change? There is a simple practice that brings this into focus, not as a ritual, but as a form of attention. Sitting in silence, allowing your awareness to move backward through your lineage, not with judgment, not with analysis, but with curiosity. What patterns repeat? What emotional tones appear across generations? And alongside that, what strengths, what resilience, what forms of intelligence have also been passed down, often unnoticed because attention has been focused on limitation? Because lineage is not only what constrains, it is also what supports. Recognizing it involves both movements, gratitude and choice. Gratitude for the life that reached you, for the continuity that made your existence possible, for the strengths that are present even if they were not always expressed clearly. And then, choice. Not as rejection of the past, but as transformation of it. The decision to become a point where certain patterns end and others begin. This is not dramatic work. It does not happen all at once. But over time, as awareness becomes more consistent, as responses become more aligned, as identity stabilizes at a different level, something subtle but profound takes place. The chain shifts, not broken, redirected, and in that shift, something becomes clear. You are not only the result of what came before you. You are also the beginning of what comes after. And that position, which might at first feel like weight, reveals itself over time as something else. Not a burden, but a rare kind of agency. The ability to become the place where a pattern changes direction and continues differently from there. Chapter 40. The Fire of Total Coherence. A life does not change when you try harder. It changes when nothing inside you is moving in different directions anymore. That shift is difficult to see from the outside because externally, effort can look the same. People can work, speak, plan, and act with intensity, and yet produce very different results. The difference is not always in what they do, but in whether their internal system is aligned or divided. Because when a person is divided within themselves, when thought, emotion, language, and action are not pointing in the same direction, energy disperses. It leaks into contradiction, into hesitation, into subtle forms of resistance that are rarely visible but always present. And over time, that dispersion becomes the hidden limit. Throughout this journey, you have encountered many elements: identity, frequency, intention, the body, silence, purpose. Each one has its own role, its own function. But none of them were meant to operate separately. They were always pointing toward a state, a condition. Something that does not come from mastering one principle, but from aligning all of them at once. Total coherence. Not as perfection, not as control, but as internal agreement. The world will not become simpler when you reach this state. It will remain unpredictable, sometimes difficult, often outside your control. Total coherence does not remove complexity from life. It removes contradiction from you. And that changes everything. Because when what you think supports what you feel, when what you feel aligns with what you say, and what you say is reflected in what you do, something stabilizes. Energy stops scattering. It begins to concentrate. Research from the HeartMath Institute gives a measurable glimpse into this. They observed that when individuals enter a state of emotional stability and alignment, the rhythm of the heart shifts into a smooth, ordered pattern. This state, known as heart coherence, is associated with synchronization between the heart and brain, improved nervous system balance, and enhanced cognitive performance, particularly in areas related to decision-making and creativity. The body, in other words, begins to operate as a unified system rather than a collection of competing signals. But this is only one layer. Total coherence extends further. It includes narrative coherence, where the story you hold about your past no longer conflicts with the direction you are moving toward. It includes values coherence, where what you claim matters is reflected in how you use your time and energy. And it includes identity coherence, where who you believe you are is not contradicted by how you behave when no one is watching. When these layers align, something changes in how force is generated, not by adding more, but by removing opposition. The image of a magnifying glass offers a clear way to see this. Sunlight is always present, always abundant, but when it is spread across a surface, it warms without transforming. When that same light is focused through a single point, it can ignite. The energy did not increase, it became coherent. And the same applies here. You already have enough energy, enough thought, enough emotional capacity. What determines the outcome is whether that energy is fragmented across conflicting directions or aligned into one. When it aligns, something ignites, not explosively, but steadily. And once that steadiness is established, it begins to influence everything else. The question then becomes how this state is developed. Not permanently at first, but in moments. Moments of full presence. Moments where there is no internal argument. Moments where action arises without hesitation because nothing inside you is pulling in the opposite direction. These moments already exist, often unnoticed, during deep focus, genuine connection, or silence. The work is not to create them from nothing, but to recognize them and begin to extend them. There is a simple way to support this process. Pausing during the day and asking, not critically, but honestly, whether the different parts of your system are aligned. Is the body tense or open? Is the emotional tone supportive or conflicting? Is the current thought moving toward or away from what matters? Is the next action consistent with the direction you've chosen? These questions do not force coherence, they reveal misalignment. And once seen, even briefly, adjustment becomes possible before fragmentation grows. Over time, this process becomes less deliberate. Not because discipline disappears, but because alignment becomes familiar. And with familiarity, it becomes easier to maintain. This is why coherence is not a single event. It is sustained, it is fed. Through everything we have explored, silence, gratitude, intention, identity, action, each one contributing to the stability of the system. Without that, the system drifts. With it, the system holds. And when it holds long enough, something changes in how you move through the world. Less effort is wasted, less energy is lost, more of what you already have becomes usable. And from that, a different kind of result begins to appear, not because you are doing more, but because nothing inside you is working against what you are doing. That is the fire. Not loud, not chaotic, but precise. And once it stabilizes, it does more than move you forward. It becomes something others can feel, not because you explain it, but because it is consistent enough to be seen without words. And that consistency is what gives it power. Chapter 41. The Last Secret. A strange realization waits at the end of every long search. The moment you see that what you were chasing was never hidden, only overlooked in plain sight. Not hidden, not locked, just overlooked. This chapter was never meant to exist in the way the others did, because what it points cannot truly be explained step by step, nor handed over as a method to follow. It resists that kind of structure. And yet, there is a certain honesty that requires it to be said plainly, even if what is said sounds almost disappointing at first. The final secret is not another technique. It is the realization that there was never a secret in the way you expected one. Not because nothing is real here, but because what is real cannot be transferred as information from one person to another. It can only be recognized, and that recognition does not happen through accumulation, but through a shift in how you see what has already been present. All the practices, the ideas, the frameworks explored throughout this journey were never ends in themselves. They were ways of clearing, adjusting, refining, until something more direct could become visible without distortion. And what becomes visible at that point feels almost disarmingly simple, that what you have been trying to reach is not separate from you. This is not a new idea. It appears across traditions that developed independently, across cultures that never intersected, and yet arrived at strikingly similar conclusions. The Zen master Huangbo Shiyun in 9th century China warned his students that their greatest mistake was searching for awakening outside themselves. The Sufi poet Rumi wrote that what you seek is already within you, that you are like an ocean searching for a drop. Plotinus, centuries earlier, described the return not as a journey outward, but as a recognition of what has always been the case. Even in modern physics, the language begins to shift in a similar direction. John Archibald Wheeler proposed that the universe is participatory, that consciousness is not a side effect of matter, but part of how reality becomes known at all. In that view, you are not standing outside the system trying to influence it. You are within it. And more than that, you are a way in which it becomes aware of itself. If that is even partially true, then something important changes. The question is no longer how to get the universe to respond to you. It becomes how to stop resisting what is already moving through you. Because manifestation, at its deepest level, is not the act of acquiring something missing. It is the removal of what prevents expression. Fear, conditioning, inherited patterns, fragmented identity, everything that has been layered over time, not as something wrong, but as something accumulated, begins to thin. And as it does, what remains is not something new. It is something uncovered. This is why the image of a diamond is often used, not as a cliché, but because it captures the structure of the process precisely. A diamond in its raw state does not shine, not because it lacks brilliance, but because it is obscured by what surrounds it. The cutting process does not add value to the diamond. It removes what is not part of it. What is revealed was always there. In the same way, every chapter you have encountered can be understood not as something added to you, but as something removed from your way of seeing, your way of responding, your way of relating to reality. Layers that once felt necessary begin to loosen, and what is left does not feel constructed. It feels familiar, as if remembered rather than learned. And this is where the direction shifts again. Because once this is seen, even briefly, the tendency to keep searching in the same way begins to lose its hold. Not because curiosity disappears, but because the center of gravity moves. You are no longer looking outward for confirmation in the same way. You begin to recognize that the movement itself, the willingness to act, to express, to engage, is what reveals what is already present. That starting is not something you do after you are ready. It is what makes readiness visible. There is still work ahead, of course. There are still layers to notice, patterns to understand, choices to make. That process does not end here, and it was never meant to. But it no longer feels like a search for something missing. It becomes a process of allowing something already whole to express itself more clearly. And that changes the tone of everything. Effort becomes more precise, attention becomes more grounded, and the idea of a final answer, something to reach once and for all, begins to dissolve into something more open, more continuous. Because what you are working with is not a fixed destination. It is an unfolding. You do not need another secret. You do not need another layer of explanation. What you need, if anything, is the willingness to stop postponing what is already available in direct experience, to act from it, to express it, to test it in the only place where it can become real, in your life. And perhaps the clearest sign that this is already happening is simple. You reached this point. You stayed with the process long enough to see it through. And that is not something that comes from outside instruction alone. It comes from recognition, from something in you that has been quietly aligned with this direction from the beginning. The rest does not need to be explained. It needs to be lived. Because the only way to know that something shines is to stop covering it and let it be seen. Chapter 42. The Art of Radical Presence. A person can spend years learning how to manifest the future and quietly lose the only place where anything can actually happen. That contradiction rarely feels obvious at first, because it hides inside something that seems positive, even purposeful. The mind keeps reaching forward, imagining, planning, refining a version of life that feels just out of reach. And in doing so, it begins to drift away from the one moment where any of it could ever take form. Not later, not someday, now. And this is where the trap reveals itself, not as failure, but as displacement. Because the more attention moves into the future, the less fully the present is inhabited. And without that presence, even the most refined intention lacks a place to land. Blaise Pascal noticed something that modern psychology would later confirm with striking precision. Human beings, he observed, struggle to remain still in a single moment without escaping into thought. What he described was not laziness, but an inability to remain with reality as it is, without needing to replace it with something imagined. Centuries later, Matthew Killingsworth, in a large-scale Harvard study using real-time experience sampling, found that people spend nearly 47% of their waking hours thinking about something other than what they are doing. And across all activities, without exception, those moments of mental drift correlated with lower reported happiness. A wandering mind, as he concluded, tends to be an unhappy one. But beyond well-being, something more subtle is happening. Because when attention leaves the present, it does not become neutral. It carries with it the emotional tone of wherever it goes. If the mind moves into memory, it carries resentment or nostalgia. If it moves into projection, it carries anxiety or anticipation. And in either case, what is being expressed in the present is not the frequency of what is happening now, but the frequency of where attention has relocated itself. This creates a quiet distortion. The field does not respond to where you wish to be. It responds to where you actually are. And where you are is determined less by physical location than by attention. This is why radical presence is not simply a calming practice or a philosophical ideal. It becomes the only stable entry point into any form of intentional creation. Not because the present moment is special in a poetic sense, but because it is the only place where thought, emotion, and action can converge without delay. The future cannot be acted in. The past cannot be altered from within itself. Only the present holds that capacity. Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh offered an image that feels almost too simple to carry weight, and yet reveals its depth in practice. When washing dishes, he suggested, the act itself is complete. Not a step towards something else, not a task to finish quickly in order to arrive at a more meaningful moment later, but the moment itself, fully inhabited. The temperature of the water, the texture of the surface, the rhythm of the movement. Nothing added, nothing deferred. At first, this seems unrelated to manifestation, until it becomes clear that the same capacity, the ability to fully inhabit what is happening without dividing attention, is the foundation of any precise action, any clear perception, any aligned response. Neuroscience supports this from another angle. When attention is fully engaged in the present, what researchers call the task-positive network becomes active, supporting focused processing, effective decision-making, and adaptive response. When attention drifts without direction, the default mode network takes over, which, while valuable for reflection and creativity, tends to produce rumination when left unchecked. The difference is not in which network is better. It is in whether attention is chosen. Presence, in this sense, is not the absence of thought. It is the absence of unconscious drift. And in practice, this extends beyond solitary awareness into something more relational. Listening, not as a social skill, but as a form of attention. When another person speaks, most of the time, part of the mind is already preparing a response, comparing, evaluating, or partially withdrawing. Full listening, without internal commentary, without distraction, without the quiet pull toward the next moment, creates a different kind of space, a shared field. And within that field, something begins to emerge that neither person could have produced alone. Ideas form differently. Trust appears without being forced. The interaction itself becomes generative. This is why presence often feels magnetic, not because it adds something new, but because it removes fragmentation. And in a world where attention is constantly divided, even briefly undivided attention becomes rare enough to be felt immediately. From this perspective, presence is not passive. It is participation at the point where experience is actually forming. And that point is always immediate. A simple way to see this is to pause, not as an exercise to complete, but as a shift in attention. Feeling the weight of the body against the surface beneath it, noticing the movement of breath without altering it, listening, first to distant sounds, then to those closer, until even the subtle rhythm of breathing becomes clear. Nothing extraordinary happens in those moments, and yet something essential becomes visible. The fact that awareness does not require movement to exist. That attention, when not pulled elsewhere, settles naturally, and when it settles, the moment expands. At first, only for a few seconds. Then gradually, for longer, until presence stops being something you practice occasionally and becomes the medium through which everything else is experienced. From there, manifestation no longer feels like something you do in addition to living. It becomes inseparable from how you live. Because the future is not built in imagination, it is built in attention. And attention fully given always returns you to the same place. Here, where everything begins, where everything is shaped, where everything becomes real. Chapter 43. The Coronation of the Being. A crown was placed on you long before you learned to question whether you deserved to wear it. Not in ceremony, not in recognition, but in the simple, unquestioned way you once existed. At the beginning of life, nothing inside you negotiated its right to be here. Breath came without hesitation. Presence demanded itself without apology. Attention, nourishment, connection, these were not things to earn, but things assumed as naturally as light filling a room when a window is opened. And somewhere along the way, that certainty was not destroyed, but covered. This final chapter does not introduce a new principle, nor a final technique to master. It returns to something far more direct, something that has been present beneath every idea explored so far, but rarely named without distortion. What you are at your core has never been broken, only obscured. From the moment awareness begins to form around identity, the world begins its subtle work, not with intention to harm, but through repetition, expectation, comparison, and interpretation. A comment absorbed too early, a moment of exclusion misunderstood, approval given conditionally, failure translated into meaning beyond the event itself. Each experience, small on its own, accumulates, and over time that accumulation begins to feel like truth, not because it is, but because it has been repeated long enough to appear stable. This is how doubt is constructed, not as a single event, but as architecture. Layer by layer, belief by belief, until what was once natural certainty becomes something distant, something that must be recovered rather than remembered. Yet nothing essential was removed, only covered. David Bohm, in his exploration of wholeness and the implicate order, suggested that fragmentation is not the true nature of reality, but a product of how perception operates at the surface level. Beneath that fragmentation, he argued, lies an underlying wholeness from which everything emerges and to which everything returns. Applied here, that insight becomes less abstract, because the sense of being incomplete, divided, or insufficient is not evidence of your nature. It is evidence of perception shaped by experience. And when perception shifts even slightly, something else becomes visible. Not something new, something underlying. The act of coronation in this sense is not an achievement. It is a recognition, not a return to childhood, not a denial of everything that has happened, but a deeper acknowledgement that what you are beneath all of it has not been altered by any of it. That what observed every experience, every failure, every moment of doubt remained intact, unreduced, unchanged, and available. This recognition does not happen once and remain effortlessly. It is something you return to again and again until the return becomes natural. Each time you choose clarity over reaction. Each time you act from what you know rather than what you fear. Each time you extend to yourself the same understanding you would offer someone you care about. These are not small moments. They are the repetition through which something deeper stabilizes. Because the world, as it is structured, does not reinforce this kind of recognition. It reinforces achievement, validation, external markers that can be measured, compared, and controlled. And in doing so, it subtly teaches that worth must be confirmed from outside. But a person who no longer depends on that confirmation moves differently, not louder, not more forcefully, but with a kind of quiet stability that cannot be easily influenced. That is sovereignty, not control over others, freedom from the need to be defined by them. A simple story illustrates this in a way that theory cannot. A student once asked a teacher how to know when enlightenment had been reached. The answer did not come immediately. Instead, it appeared years later, not in a moment of intensity, but in an ordinary kitchen, peeling an orange. The weight of it in the hand, the scent released into the air, the quiet of the room, nothing extraordinary. And yet, in that moment, something became undeniable. That what had been sought was never elsewhere. Not hidden, not distant, just unnoticed within the simplicity of direct experience. From that point forward, nothing externally changed. The same actions, the same environment, the same life. But the way of inhabiting it was no longer divided. Presence replaced searching, clarity replaced anticipation, and what had once been ordinary revealed itself as sufficient. That shift is not dramatic, it is precise, and once seen, it does not require explanation. It requires continuation. You have reached the end of this particular path, not because the subject is complete, but because the function of this path has been fulfilled. It is pointed, clarified, removed, adjusted, until something more direct could be recognized without reliance on further instruction. What remains is not another step. It is participation, not in theory, in life, because coronation does not occur at some distant moment when enough has been achieved. It occurs at the point where you stop postponing what you already recognize, where you stop waiting for permission, where you allow what has always been present to express itself without negotiation. That point is not in the future. It does not depend on readiness. It does not arrive through accumulation. It is available only in the same place. Everything else has been available from the beginning, here. And when that is seen clearly enough, even briefly, something shifts in a way that does not require force to maintain. Not because the path ends, but because it no longer feels like a search. It becomes a way of being. And from there, what follows is no longer guided by what you are trying to become, but by what you have finally allowed yourself to be. Thank you for being here, for listening all the way through, and for allowing these words to meet you where you are. If you want more content like this, don't forget to follow Book Sounds Better You so you don't miss what's next. Take care of your mind, stay present with your path, and I'll see you in the next video.